The first file was 43 seconds long. Nora Callahan had analyzed thousands of recordings in 8 years of forensic audio work. Courtroom testimony, insurance fraud, domestic abuse, documentation, corporate misconduct. She knew the texture of authentic speech, the way a sommelier knew wine, the small imperfections that proved something was real, the almost imperceptible hesitations that proved someone was lying, the grain of a voice under pressure versus a voice at rest. She had built algorithms that could detect digital manipulation to within 1/10 of a second. She had testified in federal court twice and in state court 11 times. She knew exactly what she was doing when she put on her headphones and pressed play. The first file was 43 seconds of a hospital corridor conversation, allegedly recorded on a Tuesday in November, allegedly capturing Dr. James Whitfield, chief of neurosurgery at Northwestern Memorial, telling a colleague that the Hartley case had been handled and that no one would need to look any closer. Nora listened to it once. Then she listened again. Then she sat back in her chair and stared at her monitor for a long moment before doing anything else. Something was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not the kind of wrong that a layperson would catch, not even the kind that most audio analysts would catch without looking specifically for it. But her ear had been trained on exactly this, on the threshold between authentic and manufactured. And what she was hearing sat on the wrong side of that threshold by a margin too small to name immediately, but too consistent to dismiss. She pulled up her spectrogram software and started looking for the things she'd heard. It took her 20 minutes to find it. In the background of the recording, behind the voices beneath the corridor ambiance, there was a frequency artifact. A standing wave that should not have existed in an open hallway. The kind of wave that appeared when audio was processed through certain editing suites and then re-exported. The kind of wave that to an untrained ear was completely inaudible. To Nora Callahan's ear, it was a signature. She saved her preliminary notes, marked the file for further analysis, and opened the second recording. Look. She had taken the case 3 weeks earlier, referred by a medical liability attorney named Casey Park, who had been sending her work for 4 years, and who had the instinct of someone who knew when something didn't add up. The official story was straightforward. A series of internal hospital recordings had surfaced 12 files in total, allegedly documenting Dr. James Whitfield discussing the suppression of a surgical error that had resulted in permanent neurological damage for a patient named Harold Hartley. The hospital's internal review board had placed Whitfield on administrative leave pending investigation. The case was moving toward a formal disciplinary hearing that would almost certainly end his career. Casey Park's client was not Harold Hartley. Her client was the hospital's insurance carrier, who had their own reasons for wanting an independent assessment of the recordings before anyone did anything irrevocable. "I need you to tell me if these are real," Casey had said, passing the drive across her desk. "Not whether the conversation happened. Whether the recordings of the conversation are authentic." "Those are very different questions," Nora had said. "I know. That's why I'm asking someone who understands the difference." She had taken the drive home, which was an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on North Dearborn, and set it on her desk beside the monitor that ran her analysis suite, and looked at it for a day before opening it. Not because she doubted her ability to do the work, because she understood that some cases had weight before you'd heard a single second of audio, and this was one of them. A man's career, a patient's injury, 12 recordings. The assumption of guilt already embedded in how the question was being asked. She opened the drive on a Wednesday morning in October and pressed play on the first file. By the end of the first day, she had found the signature artifact in 9 of the 12 recordings. By the end of the second day, she had found it in all 12. By the end of the third day, she had run the kind of exhaustive spectral analysis that would hold up in a courtroom, and had documented with the precision her training required exactly what she was looking at. The recordings had been edited. Not crudely, whoever had done this knew what they were doing. The source audio was real voices, real hospital ambience, real timestamps that aligned with documented events. But the words had been rearranged, sentences spliced from different conversations, different days, different contexts. The word handled pulled from one recording and placed into a different one. A question and its answer reversed. 17 separate edits across 12 files, each one executed with the kind of technical competence that suggested professional audio equipment and professional knowledge of how to use it. The signature artifact was not intentional. It was the kind of mistake that happened when you exported from one software environment into another without knowing exactly how the codec behaved at the boundary frequencies. The kind of mistake that only showed up if you knew to look for it. The kind of mistake that Nora had spent 8 years learning to find. James Whitfield had not said what the recordings claimed he'd said. She sat with this information for half a day before she called Casey Park. "I need to meet with you in person," she said. "Not over the phone." "That kind of news," Casey said. "That kind of news." They met at Casey's office in the Loop the following morning. Nora brought her laptop, her printed analysis, and the specific quality of stillness she had developed for the moments when the truth she was about to deliver was going to matter very much to someone. "The recordings are fabricated," she said, and watched Casey's face process this. "All of them. All 12. The underlying audio is real. These are real conversations from real hospital environments. But the content has been edited. Sentences taken from different contexts and reassembled to mean something the speakers never said." She turned her laptop toward Casey and walked her through the spectral analysis, the frequency artifacts, the editing points she had identified and marked. This took skill. Not extraordinary skill, but professional-level competence. Someone who knows audio editing and understands how institutional recordings are typically authenticated. Casey was quiet for a long moment. "James Whitfield is completely innocent. Of what the recordings allege, yes. What happened in the Hartley surgery, I can't speak to that, but these recordings don't document it. Do you know who fabricated them? That's not my question to answer. I can tell you the technical characteristics of the editing. What software family was likely used, what kind of hardware, what skill level. But attribution isn't forensic audio, that's investigation." Casey picked up her pen and didn't write anything with it. "I need you to document all of this. Everything. Formal report, court, ready." "I'm already drafting it." "And Nora?" Casey looked at her. "This is going to create a significant disruption. When it comes out that the recordings are fabricated, someone is going to start asking who fabricated them. That's going to point at someone in that hospital." "I know. Are you prepared for the disruption that comes with being the person who made that finding?" Nora thought about the 43 seconds she had listened to on the first morning, the frequency artifact she had found in 20 minutes that everyone else had missed, the 17 editing points that once she had documented them were completely incontrovertible. "I made the finding because it's what the evidence shows," she said. "The disruption is secondary." Casey looked at her with the expression of someone who appreciated that answer and also knew from experience that the disruption was never entirely secondary. "All right," she said, "let's talk about what comes next." What came next, among other things, was James Whitfield. Casey had arranged a meeting with his legal team, a necessity since the insurance carrier's interest and Whitfield's personal interest had now aligned in a way that changed the case structure considerably. The meeting was at a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue on a Thursday afternoon when the lake was doing what it did in late October, which was to make the entire eastern edge of the city look like a painting that hadn't decided whether to be beautiful or threatening. Nora arrived early, which she did for everything. She was reviewing her notes when the door opened and James Whitfield came in. She had, in the course of her research, looked him up. 41 years old. Northwestern Medical School residency at Johns Hopkins, returned to Chicago 12 years ago. Chief of neurosurgery for the past 4. Board certifications in 3 subspecialties. A publication record that ran to 47 peer-reviewed papers. A patient outcome record that, by every metric she could find, was exceptional. The man who walked into the conference room was taller than his photographs suggested, and the photographs had not conveyed the specific quality of his stillness, the self-containment of someone who had spent years operating in environments where losing control of your focus cost people their lives. He wore a dark suit rather than hospital clothes, but the posture was the same as the posture in the photographs taken in surgical suites. Precise contained the body of someone who did not waste motion. He looked at her before he looked at anyone else in the room, not aggressively, with the focused attention of someone taking in available information. "Ms. Callahan," he said, "I've read your preliminary report. Dr. Whitfield." He sat. His legal team arranged themselves around him. Casey was beside Nora. The insurance carrier's representative was at the far end of the table and didn't speak much. For the next 2 hours, Nora walked the room through everything she had found: the artifacts, the editing points, the spectral analysis, the methodology she had used, and the peer-reviewed literature that validated it. She answered questions from the legal team with the precision she brought to cross-examination preparation, because she understood that everything said in this room might eventually be said in a courtroom. Whitfield asked 3 questions during the entire presentation. Each one was exactly the right question, the one that probed the single point most likely to be challenged, that identified the methodology's exposure before an adversarial questioner could exploit it. 3 questions in 2 hours, but they were the 3 questions that mattered. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You're certain," he said. Not a question exactly the phrasing of someone who understood that certainty in forensic work was a technical claim with a specific meaning. "I'm certain within the bounds of what forensic audio analysis can establish," she said, "which is a very high bound. The editing is documented, reproducible, and would be corroborated by any competent independent analyst who applied the same methodology. Someone inside the hospital did this. Someone with access to institutional recordings and professional-level audio editing capability. Yes. That narrows it considerably." "It does." Another silence. The legal team was exchanging glances that Nora was not supposed to notice and did notice. Whitfield was looking at the spectral analysis printout in front of him with the focused attention of someone reading a result he already knew but needed to see documented. "Thank you," he said finally, "for the thoroughness, for the—" He paused. "For finding it." "It's what I do," she said. Not everyone would have. She thought about this 43 seconds. The frequency artifact in the background noise that she had heard before she had found it. The specific quality of trained attention that had told her something was wrong before her software confirmed it. "Some things are only visible to certain kinds of attention," she said. He looked at her. Then not the professional assessment of the first moment, but something more direct, as if the sentence had said more than its literal content. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." She did not think about that moment on the drive home. Or she thought about it once and then deliberated, set it aside because she was a professional and the case was ongoing, and the specific quality of his attention when she had said certain kinds of attention was not information she was supposed to be processing in any personal register. She was 9 months into a period of deliberate solitude that had followed a 2-year relationship that had ended in a way she was still occasionally making sense of. The relationship had been with a man who was charming and interesting, and had gradually revealed himself to be someone who found her professional intensity fascinating in the abstract and exhausting in daily life. The breakup had been conducted with civility on both sides and had left her with a 1-bedroom apartment she loved, a caseload she found genuinely meaningful, and a firm conviction that she was not going to let anyone else into her life until she was completely certain she understood what she was choosing and why. She did not think about James Whitfield's attention on the drive home. She thought about the case. The case required her to figure out who had made those recordings, which was technically not her job, but was practically unavoidable once she had established what they were. She spent the following week building a profile of the editor, the software characteristics, the specific codec behavior, the level of expertise required. She sent the profile to Casey. Casey sent it to the hospital's security team and to a digital forensics consultant who specialized in institutional data systems. 3 days later, the security team had a name, Dr. Paul Dermott, senior attending neurosurgeon, 12-year tenure at Northwestern, specialist in spinal cases. 13 months ago, he had overseen the Hartley surgery not as the primary surgeon, but as the senior consultant whose judgment call had been the critical decision point, the decision that had gone wrong. Whitfield had been the department head. Any formal investigation would begin with him. Dermott had access to the recording system. He had a home studio set up, documented in an invoice flagged during the security review that included exactly the software family Nora's analysis had identified. He had a motive so clear that once you saw it, it was impossible to unsee shift the blame before the investigation found him. Casey called Nora the morning the name came through. "Dermott," she said, "I saw the email. His attorney is already on the phone trying to preempt everything. He's going to claim the recordings are authentic and that your analysis is flawed. He's welcome to hire his own analyst." Nora was at her desk looking at the spectral comparison she had been refining for the past week. "The artifacts are there. Independent analysis will confirm them." "I know. I'm telling you because he's also going to make noise about your professional relationship with Whitfield." Nora set down her coffee. "I don't have a professional relationship with Whitfield. I attended one meeting." "You attended one meeting that resulted in findings that exonerate him. Dermott's attorney will frame that as motivated analysis. They can frame whatever they like. The methodology is documented and peer-reviewed. It stands independently of anything about me." "I know it does," Casey said. "I'm just making sure you're prepared for the noise." She was prepared for the noise. She had been prepared for noise in various forms since the first time she had testified in court, At 31, an opposing counsel had spent 20 minutes trying to suggest that a woman who listened to recordings for a living was not a credible expert witness. She had handled it then, and she would handle it now. What she was less prepared for was the phone call that came from Whitfield himself 2 days later. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered as she always did on the second ring. Miss Callahan. His voice was exactly as she'd filed it, measured, precise, the diction of someone for whom being understood accurately mattered professionally. I hope this isn't an inappropriate time to call. It's not. What can I do for you? I wanted to ask you something directly rather than through the attorneys. A pause. Dermot's camp is going to attempt to discredit your analysis. I'm told they've already been in contact with an audio consultant in New York who has offered to prepare a competing expert report. That's their right. I know. I wanted to ask, and please tell me if this is outside what you're comfortable with, whether there's anything in your analysis that could be strengthened before it becomes a formal legal record. Any additional documentation, any further methodology I should understand so I can support your findings if I'm asked directly. She thought about the question. It was technically an unusual request, the subject of an investigation, asking the forensic analyst what would make the findings more bulletproof. But there was nothing improper in it. He wasn't asking her to change her findings. He was asking to understand them better. There are 2 additional tests I've been planning to run, she said. Comparative authentication against recordings from the same system that aren't in dispute. If those authenticate cleanly under the same methodology, it establishes the baseline. The artifacts in the disputed files then stand out more clearly. How long would that take? 3 days? Maybe 4? Can I facilitate access to the non-disputed recordings? The hospital's legal team has been cooperative. I think I can arrange it within 24 hours if you let me know specifically what you need. She told him specifically what she needed. He had it arranged by the following afternoon. He sent a brief email when the files were transferred. The recordings you requested are in the secure folder Casey set up. Let me know if anything is missing or if you need additional context about the recording system. It was a professional email. She read it twice. She ran the comparative analysis over the next 4 days. The clean recordings authenticated exactly as she'd expected. No artifacts, no editing signatures. The consistent spectrographic profile of authentic institutional audio. Placed against the disputed files, the contrast was unambiguous. She added 30 pages to her report. She sent the updated report to Casey on a Thursday evening. Casey called the next morning. "This is airtight," Casey said. "Yes." "Their expert in New York is going to have a very difficult time." "Yes." A pause. "Nora, Whitfield asked me something this morning." "What?" "Whether it would be appropriate to thank you personally, in some way that wasn't the formal legal channel." Another pause. "I told him that was a question he should ask you, not me." Nora looked out her window at the lake, which was gray and flat on this particular Friday morning, doing none of the painting things. "Tell him coffee is fine," she said. "If he wants?" He called that afternoon and suggested a place she knew near the hospital, a coffee shop on Erie Street that took its coffee seriously and did not take its ambiance seriously, which she considered the correct priority. They met on a Saturday, which was the first time she had seen him outside of a conference room or a hospital corridor photograph. He arrived before her, which she noted. He was in weekend clothes, a dark sweater, no tie. The deliberate casualness of someone who had very precise standards even in his casual wardrobe. He was reading something on his phone when she came in, looked up, when the door opened and put the phone away immediately. "Thank you for coming," he said when she sat down. "You wanted to say something that wasn't through the attorneys." "I did." He held his coffee with both hands, not nervously, the habitual gesture of someone who thought better when they had something to hold. "I want to say that what you found, I knew the recordings weren't real. I knew it from the moment I heard them, because I knew what I had and hadn't said. But knowing and being able to prove it are completely different things, and I had no way to prove it. I was watching a career I've built over 20 years being dismantled by something I couldn't even fully articulate." She waited. "You found something that I couldn't have found myself, and that no one else had found, and that made it possible to tell the truth. That matters to me in a way I'm having some difficulty fitting into a professional thank you." He looked at her directly. "So this is the non-professional thank you, which I understand may be unusual under the circumstances." "It's a little unusual," she said, "but I appreciate it. I read your other cases. Not to be invasive, Casey mentioned you had a public record of prior testimony, and I looked at it. The insurance fraud cases. the abuse documentation, the corporate work. He paused. You consistently find the thing everyone else missed. I was trained to look for specific things. Most people trained for specific things look for those specific things and nothing else. You seem to look for what's actually there. He held her gaze. That's different. She thought about the first morning and the 43 seconds and the frequency artifact she had heard before her software confirmed it. It's a particular kind of listening, she said. You develop it or you don't. Can it be learned? Some of it. The technical elements, yes. The instinct, she paused. I think you either have a version of it or you don't. You felt something was wrong with those recordings from the first moment. I knew they didn't reflect what I'd said. You knew, but you couldn't articulate why. That's the instinct. The articulation comes from the training. He considered this. Surgery works the same way. You develop a sense for how a case is going, something in the feedback you're feeling, something in the patient's response that tells you a decision needs to be made before the instruments give you the data. The instruments confirm what you already know. But you need both. She looked at him the careful way he was drawing the parallel. Not to be charming, but because he genuinely meant it. Because he was the kind of person who thought by finding the structural similarity between things. She recognized that. She did it herself. You asked about the comparative analysis, she said. What you can say if you're asked directly. Do you want to go through it? Yes, he said. I do. They spent the rest of the coffee going through the methodology. He asked good questions. She gave precise answers. The coffee was excellent, and neither of them mentioned it. When they left standing on Erie Street in the November cold, he said, This is going to go to the review board within the month. Casey thinks so, yes. When it does, you'll be asked to testify. I'm prepared for that. I know you are. He looked at her with the steady attention she had filed on the first day and had not stopped thinking about, though she continued to maintain that she was not thinking about it. Thank you, Ms. Callahan, for the rigor. For finding it, she said. That's what you said last week. Both, he said. The rigor and the finding it. They're not separate. She walked back to her car through the November cold and drove home, and did not think about the coffee on the drive except to think about it once and set it aside. That night she found herself sitting at her desk at 11 o'clock, not working on the case, which was unusual because when she was invested in a case, she worked until she couldn't, but thinking about the conversation, about the comparison between audio instinct and surgical instinct, about the specific precision with which he had found the one question in a 2-hour presentation that most needed to be asked. She was not. She told herself developing a personal interest in the subject of a case she was actively working. She was simply noting things, the way she always noted things, professionally. She went to bed at midnight, set her alarm for 6, and was in the bathroom at 6:15 when she realized that her period was 11 days late. She stood there for a moment with that information in the cool, early morning of her apartment on North Dearborn. Then she went to the kitchen and made coffee. Then she went to the drugstore on the corner at 7 when it opened and bought a pregnancy test. Then she came home and sat on the edge of the bathroom sink and waited. 2 lines. She looked at them for a long time. Then she made a second cup of coffee that she did not drink and sat at her kitchen table and thought about the specific architecture of a situation that was in almost every measurable way more complicated than anything she had encountered in 8 years of professionally complicated situations. She was pregnant. She was pregnant with the child of the man whose career she had just saved. She was still actively working his case. She set the test on the table and looked at it and thought with the precision she applied to everything about what came next. The first thing was the case. The case had to be finished the right way, documented. Filed her analysis complete and court-ready before anything else. Nothing about her personal situation could be allowed to compromise the integrity of what she had built over the past 6 weeks. The work was the work. It stood independently. The second thing was telling Casey. Not about the pregnancy, not yet, but about the fact that there were now personal elements that Casey, as the attorney managing the case, needed to know existed. The third thing was figuring out how to tell James Whitfield that the forensic analyst who had saved his career was pregnant in circumstances that she needed to explain carefully and truthfully, because the alternative handling this without telling him was not something she was capable of choosing. She poured the second cup of coffee down the drain, rinsed the mug, and went to her desk. She had a report to finalize. Casey Park did not say anything for 7 full seconds after Nora finished talking. Okay, Casey said. I'm telling you because you need to know there are personal circumstances that post-date my engagement on this case, but that you should be aware of. Post-date? Casey repeated. The circumstances began after you were retained. Correct. After all analytical work was complete. After the findings were made. After everything that constitutes my professional contribution to this matter was done. The work is finished. The formal report is drafted and ready to file. The comparative analysis is complete. My testimony preparation is in progress. None of that is affected by what I'm telling you. Casey was quiet for another moment. He doesn't know. No. When are you going to tell him? After the report is filed, Nora said. Not because I'm managing the situation strategically, because I want there to be no question that the filing of the report and the personal conversation are completely separate events. That's actually the right call, Casey said. Professionally speaking. I know it is. Nora. A pause. Are you all right? I'm processing it, she said, which is what I do. She filed the report on a Wednesday. It was 104 pages. It included the original analysis, the comparative baseline methodology, the 30-page addendum, 4 appendices of raw spectral data, and a conclusion that was, as Casey had said, airtight. She called James Whitfield that evening. He answered on the second ring. The report has been filed, she said. Casey will have confirmed it. I saw. A brief pause. It's comprehensive. He stopped. I read it this afternoon. All of it. Good. Another pause. Is there something else? She had thought about how to do this. She had arrived at the conclusion that there was no version of this that was elegant, and that the attempt to make it elegant would be worse than just being direct. There's something I need to tell you that's unrelated to the case, she said. Completely unrelated, the case is finished, and what I'm about to tell you has no bearing on any of it. But you need to know, and I'd rather tell you directly than have you find out another way. The quality of his silence changed. All right, I'm pregnant, she said. It's yours. We were together once the night after the second case meeting before the comparative analysis began. I know there's no version of this that's simple. The silence was long enough that she counted it. 8 seconds. Are you sure? He said. Not about the paternity, the question was too careful for that. He was asking if she was certain about the pregnancy itself. Yes. How far along? 7 weeks approximately. Another silence. She waited it out without filling it because she had said what needed to be said, and anything she added now would be noise. Can we meet, he said. In person, not the attorneys, just the two of us. Yes, she said. They met the following evening at a restaurant on Halsted that was quiet enough for a real conversation and public enough that neither of them was trapped. He was there when she arrived, which she had come to expect. He stood when she came in. They sat. The server came and went. Neither of them opened the menu. I want to be honest with you, he said, before anything else. All right. I'm not going to pretend this is simple or that I know exactly what I think about it yet. What I can tell you is what I know right now. He held her gaze. I want to be part of this child's life. Whatever form that takes, I understand that's not my decision alone to make, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But I want you to know that clearly. I appreciate the clarity, and I want to understand what you want, what you're thinking, not to tell you what to do with it to understand. She had been thinking about that question for 6 days with the same methodical attention she brought to everything she decided. I'm going to continue the pregnancy, she said. That decision is made. What I haven't figured out is the rest of it. What our relationship looks like. What kind of arrangement makes sense, how we build something that works for a child without either of us losing what matters to us. What matters to you? My work, my independence, my ability to think clearly without someone else's priorities overriding mine. She looked at him. I've been in situations where those things were compromised by a relationship, and I'm not willing to do that again. I understand that. Do you? I think so. He was thoughtful, not defensive. My work also defines me in ways that have made relationships difficult. I'm not easy to be with, I know that about myself. I keep hours that are incompatible with most people's expectations. I have a professional obligation that takes precedence over almost everything, and I've never been able to pretend otherwise. A pause. What I've never had was someone who understood that from the same position, someone whose work was their own, and who wasn't asking me to choose. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to choose anything. I know. He paused again. That's not nothing. They talked until 9:30. not about romance or relationships in any conventional sense, about the practical architecture of a situation that required practical thinking, what kind of legal framework made sense, what the next months looked like, how they each understood the difference between what the child needed and what they each wanted from the situation. She found exactly the kind of person she had expected. From the 3 questions in the conference room, someone who thought carefully, said what he meant, and did not use the difficulty of a situation as a reason to avoid being direct about it. When they left on the sidewalk outside the Chicago, November had gone fully cold. The aggressive cold that reminded you the lake was right there and it had opinions. "I'll have my attorney reach out to Casey," he said, "to start talking about the legal framework." "Good. And—" He paused. "I'd like to talk again, outside of the legal channel, if that's something you're open to." She thought about the coffee on Erie Street and the conversation about audio instinct and surgical instinct, about the way he had drawn the parallel not to be charming, but because he genuinely thought that way, about the fact that she had filed the most important report of her career and had spent 4 days not thinking about it and thinking about him instead, which was data she had been ignoring and could no longer entirely ignore. "I'm open to it," she said. He nodded once. "I'll call." She walked to her car and drove home through the Chicago cold and let herself into her apartment and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet, her hand on her stomach that was still flat and would not be flat for long. "Complicated," she said to the room, and to the thing inside her that wasn't yet anything she could name but was already the most concrete fact of her life. "You picked a very complicated entry point." The room did not respond. She made tea, sat at her desk, and began drafting her schedule for the next 6 months. Because that was what she did. She found the thing, she named it, and then she figured out what to do next. The formal review board hearing was scheduled for January 15th. Between November and January, Nora built her testimony, the way she built everything methodically, without gaps, testing each element against the most adversarial version of itself she could construct. She ran her analysis a 4th time. She prepared answers to questions that had not yet been asked. She contacted 2 colleagues at peer institutions, audio forensic specialists, whose work she respected, and asked them, without disclosing the specifics of the case, to review her methodology and identify anything challengeable. Both came back with minor suggestions that she incorporated. Neither found anything that undermined the core finding. Dermot's expert in New York submitted his competing report in early December. She read it in 2 hours. It was technically competent in the way that technically competent reports prepared to support a predetermined conclusion were technically competent selective in what it examined, loose in its statistical framing, and conspicuously silent on the frequency artifacts she had documented in 9 separate sections of her own report. She sent her rebuttal to Casey inside 48 hours. 7 pages. Each page addressed one specific claim in the New York report and explained in language a judge could follow exactly why the claim failed. Casey read it and said, "I want to print this out and frame it." "File it," Nora said. "That's more useful." During this period, she also saw James Whitfield 4 times, which was more than she had planned and fewer than she found herself wanting, and this discrepancy was itself a kind of information she was still deciding what to do with. The first was a working dinner at a Thai place on Clark Street, ostensibly to review testimony preparation, but actually evolving into a conversation that lasted 2.5 hours and covered, among other things, the specific challenges of expert testimony in medical cases, the way surgeons and forensic analysts both operated in the gap between certainty and action, what it was like to be trained to make life or death decisions under time pressure, and the fact that he had grown up in Cincinnati and had been the first person in his immediate family to pursue a graduate degree. The second was a lunch near the hospital where he was technically back on administrative duties. Pending the hearing, he was not operating yet, which she understood from his posture and the specific controlled quality of his patients was costing him something significant. They talked about the pregnancy for the first time outside the initial conversation. She was 12 weeks. She had had the first trimester screening and everything was unremarkable, which was the word she used because it was accurate and because she had trained herself not to invest emotionally in clinical data before she had enough of it. "Unremarkable," he repeated. "Medically, that's the goal." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother had 2 miscarriages before my sister. She told me once that the worst part wasn't the losses themselves, but that you couldn't prepare for them. You just had to wait and see." She looked at him. "That's not what I'm doing." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "I'm just saying if you wanted to talk about it, in the non-clinical register. I'm available for that. She had not talked about it in the non-clinical register with anyone except her sister in Columbus. And even that conversation had been more logistical than emotional because Nora was better at logistics than emotions, and her sister had learned to work with that. Maybe later, she said. Whenever, he said. The third and fourth meetings were in December once for coffee once when he called at 10 on a Tuesday night because a case in the hospital had gone unexpectedly difficult and he needed to talk to someone who would understand what he meant when he described making a decision under conditions of insufficient information and being unable to know until much later whether it was right. She was at her desk. She stayed on the phone for an hour. You should sleep, she said when they had talked it through. I will. A pause. Thank you for answering. You can call again, she said, if it happens again. I'll try not to make it a habit. I didn't say that. She was aware in this period of building something she had not agreed to build and could not clearly name. It was not a relationship in the conventional sense. They had not been on a date, had not said anything that required reciprocation, had not made any agreement about what they were to each other. But it was something, a frequency she was beginning to tune to, a presence that had established itself in her understanding of her day in the way that significant things did not dramatically, but structurally, as a feature of how she was navigating. She was also 17 weeks pregnant, which did not change her professional life in any visible way yet, and was changing everything underneath. The review board hearing lasted 2 days. Dermot's attorney spent the first morning trying to establish that the recordings were authentic, leading his own expert through a presentation that Nora sat through with the specific patience of someone who had already written the rebuttal and was simply waiting for the relevant moment. When her turn came in the afternoon, she presented her findings in the order she had prepared methodically, clearly, without technical jargon, where plain language served with technical precision where the methodology required it. The rebuttal to the New York expert took 40 minutes. She walked the board through each of the 7 pages she had given Casey slowly enough that the board members who were not audio specialists could follow. She did not speak to Dermot during this, which was deliberate. Her findings were about the recordings. Her findings were not about him. He was removed from the room for part of her testimony per the board's procedure. When he was brought back in, she did not look at him. Whitfield testified on the second day. He was, as she had expected from the 3 questions, precise, neither defensive nor performed, simply factual. He described what he had and had not said in the conversations that were the basis of the disputed recordings. He described the Hartley case from the perspective of the department head reviewing a surgical outcome, not the primary surgeon making the decisions. He was asked directly about Dermot. He was careful. She was in the hallway when he came out during the lunch break. "How are you?" she asked. "Controlled," he said, which was honest. "It's going well, because of your testimony. The board chair asked me off the record whether I had retained you specifically or whether you came through the insurance carrier." He looked at her. "I said the insurance carrier, which is accurate. It is accurate. I want to be transparent about the fact that I then spent approximately 3 minutes wanting to say something that wasn't accurate but that felt more true." She looked at him. He looked back. The hallway was institutional and fluorescent, and the lunch break was 20 minutes. "Controlled," she said. "Yes." A pause. "I'm going to get through today. After today, there's a different conversation." "After today," she agreed. The board delivered its finding on January 17th, 2 days after the hearing closed, which was faster than usual. All disciplinary actions against James Whitfield were rescinded. The case was referred to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation for investigation of Dr. Paul Dermot. Pending that investigation, Dermot's hospital privileges were suspended. Casey called Nora at 9 in the morning. "It's done." "I saw. He's been restored to full surgical privileges. He's operating Thursday." "Good." She meant it in the precise way the thing that needed to happen had happened. "Nora?" A pause. "How are you feeling?" "Relieved," she said, in a specific and bounded way. "That's the most you response possible." "Thank you." She was at her desk when her phone rang at 10, a number she recognized now. She answered. "Full restoration," he said. "I just came from the board." "I know, Casey called." "Are you at your apartment?" "Yes. I'd like to come by. If that's something you'd be comfortable with. I have something I want to say that I've been holding until this was resolved." She looked at her apartment, the desk with the audio workstation, the bookshelves full of acoustics, texts, and court transcripts, the kitchen that she had finally started cooking in properly, now that the first trimester nausea had eased. She was 19 weeks. She was visible now in a way she hadn't been in November. Mom boy. Hi, she said. He arrived 40 minutes later, which meant he had driven directly from Northwestern. He was still in his hospital badge, which he pulled off when she answered the door, with the automatic gesture of someone removing work before entering a different kind of space. She had made coffee. He took it and sat at her kitchen table and looked around at the apartment, at the recording equipment, the stacked case files, the framed spectrographic print she had put on the wall 3 years ago. Because it was beautiful in a way that only made sense to someone who understood what it represented. "What did you want to say?" she asked. He looked at her. "I've been keeping 2 conversations separate since November," he said. "The legal one and the personal one. I kept them separate because I needed the legal one to be done before the personal one could be honest." "I understand that. Now it's done." He held the coffee. "So the personal one." She waited. "I've been building a picture of you since the conference room," he said. "Not deliberately, but you, the way you think, the way you listen, the way you handle complexity without requiring it to resolve faster than it naturally does. I've been paying attention to it." He met her eyes. "And I'm aware that the circumstances are complicated in ways that could be an argument against saying any of this. But I've decided that not saying it because the circumstances are complicated is its own kind of problem." "What are you saying?" "That I want this to be something. Whatever this is, whatever form makes sense, whatever pace you need, whatever conditions you need in place before you're willing to consider it. I want to build it rather than manage it at arm's length." He paused. "And I want you to know that whatever you decide about that, my involvement with the baby is not contingent on anything else. Those are separate." She sat with his words the way she sat with a new recording, without rushing toward a conclusion, letting the layers settle. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I've been doing the same thing, building the picture." She looked at him. "I'm not someone who does this, says things before I'm certain, but I'm certain enough to say that what you just described is mutual." The specific quality of his silence in response to that was something she filed and kept. "Certain enough?" he said. "In forensic work, certain enough is the highest standard available. You never get absolute. You get reproducible, documentable, and sufficient for action. And this is sufficient for action." "Yes. What action?" She thought about it. "Start with dinner," she said. "A real one, not testimony prep." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow is fine." January became February, and February became March. And the thing that had started in a conference room on Michigan Avenue in October became with the gradual certainty of things that are built rather than declared real. Dinner on a Thursday. A Sunday walk along the lakefront that was cold enough to require serious coats, but clear enough that the water was blue all the way to the horizon. A Tuesday evening when she was at her desk, and he texted asking if he could bring food because he was on her side of the city and had not yet eaten, and she said yes, and he arrived with Thai. From the place on Clark, and they ate at her kitchen table and talked until midnight without noticing the time. She was 22 weeks. The baby a boy, they had learned at the anatomy scan, a fact that she had received with the same careful containment she applied to all clinical data and had not processed emotionally until she was alone in her car in the hospital parking lot. At which point she had put her hands on the steering wheel and breathed for 3 minutes, was developing exactly as he should, according to Dr. Anita Rhodes, who had the specific competence with warmth of a practitioner who understood that her patients were people and not just cases. Whitfield came to the 20-week appointment. He had asked. She had said yes. Dr. Rhodes shook his hand with the frank efficiency of someone who had seen every configuration of this particular situation and was professionally indifferent to all of them. "Standard anatomy scan," she said. "Do you want to know the sex?" Nora said yes. He said, "Whatever you want," simultaneously. Rhodes raised an eyebrow and moved on. The scan was 38 minutes. The baby was visible on the screen in the specific, detailed, opinionated way that 20-week anatomy scans made real in those hands that were covering his face with the evident intention of remaining private about it. A heartbeat that was strong and unhurried and completely indifferent to the complexity of his situation. Whitfield stood at the edge of Nora's peripheral vision. She did not look at him. She looked at the screen. "Everything is excellent," Rhodes said. "Growth is on track. Heartbeat is perfect." She pointed to the screen. "He's not cooperating with one particular view I need, so we may be here a few extra minutes." "Consistent with established personality," Whitfield said quietly, and it was so specifically accurate that Nora made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. She was 26 weeks when he said on a Wednesday evening in her kitchen that he thought they should talk about what the next few months looked like practically. Casey has a draft agreement, she said, for co-parenting. I know. I've read it. He turned his coffee cup. I want to talk about something outside that framework, the living situation. What about it? Oh, you're on the 3rd floor. There's no elevator. Your building has 12 units and 1 parking space per unit, and you don't have a car. I have a very good transit connection. In February and March, yes, with a newborn in a Chicago winter. He stopped. I'm not making a decision for you. I'm observing something that I think deserves a conversation. She had thought about this. She was honest enough to acknowledge she had been thinking about it for weeks and avoiding the thinking because the thinking led to conclusions that felt significant. What are you proposing? I'm not proposing anything. He met her eyes. I'm opening a conversation about whether we want to figure out something that makes logistical sense for a child who is going to need both of us in close proximity in a way that doesn't require either of us to compromise what matters to us. What matters to you in this context? Being present, not on a scheduled rotation that treats him like a custody arrangement before he can walk. Being in his daily life, he paused. Being in yours if that's something you want. She looked at him. That's a significant thing to put in a sentence. I know it is. I've been holding it for about 3 weeks. She stood up and went to the window. Outside, North Dearborn was doing its March thing, the specific grayness of Chicago early spring, the city deciding whether winter was actually over. My lease is up in May, she said. I know. You mentioned it in January. You retained that. I retain things that matter. She turned back. I would need a workspace. A real one, not a corner of a shared apartment. Of course. And I would need to know that I could leave for a case whenever a case required it without that being a problem. That's not going to be a problem. My schedule is... He paused. My schedule is not compatible with someone who needs predictability from me. We'd both need to be flexible about that. I'm flexible. I just need to know the rules in advance. Agreed. She looked at him across the kitchen. The careful composure, the coffee he always held, when he was thinking the specific quality of his attention that had not changed since October, and that she had not stopped noticing. Find something with a proper second bedroom, she said, with room for a workspace. I've been looking, he said. I have 3 options. I wasn't going to show them to you until you were ready. Show me tomorrow. Tomorrow, he agreed. They found the apartment on a tree-lined block in Lincoln Square, a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a graystone that had the kind of bones Chicago graystone had when they hadn't been renovated into blandness. High ceilings, original woodwork. A 2nd bedroom large enough for both a nursery and a proper workstation if the furniture was arranged correctly. Windows that faced east and got the morning light. She walked through it twice. He walked through it once, then waited. The 2nd bedroom needs shelving, she said. I'll have it installed before we move in. And I need a separate entrance to the workspace side if we're both working from home. There's a 2nd door off the hallway. We can rekey it. She looked at the east-facing windows, at the morning light, at the ceiling height that she had not realized she had been longing for until she was standing under it. The building has a parking space, she said. It does. I don't have a car. I do. He looked at her. We'd share. She had a lease up in May. The baby was due in June. The math was straightforward. The math was not really what she was thinking about. I'll need Casey to look at whatever framework covers the living situation, she said. Of course. And I'm not changing my name or any, I know, he said. I'm not asking for anything that isn't freely given. He met her gaze. That's the only arrangement that works. She looked at the morning light on the east wall of what would be the nursery. Tell the landlord we'll take it, she said. Needs. They signed the lease in April. The shelving was installed in the 2nd bedroom within the week. Whitfield had characteristically already gotten quotes from 3 contractors and selected the one whose work he had verified through references. The workspace was functional before the nursery was. She noticed that. She noted it as information. They painted the nursery together on a Saturday in late April, which was not planned. The painter arrived and explained that the VOC content in the paint he'd been planning to use was inadvisable for someone in the 3rd trimester, at which point Nora specified that she was supervising the color match personally and would be wearing a proper respirator, and Whitfield specified that in that case, he would also be painting because 2 sets of eyes were better for color accuracy, and the painter looked between them and then quietly handed them both rollers and went to get lunch. The color was a deep slate blue-gray that Nora had chosen from a sample book because it was the color of the lake when it was deciding between beautiful and threatening, which she had decided was the right color for someone she expected to have strong opinions. They painted. Neither of them mentioned what it meant. The Dermot disciplinary proceedings moved forward in the background, a process measured in months with the deliberate pace of institutional consequence. Illinois YDF PR opened a formal investigation. Dermot's attorney mounted a defense that became as the evidence mounted progressively less tenable. The New York expert quietly withdrew his affiliation with the case in March. By April, there were reports that Dermot was in discussions with the licensing board about a negotiated resolution. Nora followed the proceedings without being in them. Her work was done. The report stood. Whatever happened next was the machinery of consequence operating as it should. In May, she got a call she was not expecting. The voice was a woman's mid-50s, careful, the specific tone of someone who had thought about making this call for a while before making it. "Miss Callahan, my name is Lynn Hartley. Harold Hartley is my husband." Nora was at her desk. She set down her pen. "Mrs. Hartley, I know you're not involved in the legal proceedings around Harold's case. I know you were retained for a different purpose." A pause. "I also know what you found because the attorney representing us in Harold's case has been in contact with the review board and has access to your report." "All right. I called because I wanted to tell you something that probably doesn't fit into any legal process." Another pause longer. "Harold has known since November that Dr. Whitfield didn't do what they said he did. The recording that was supposedly from the surgery review, Harold recognized it was wrong because he'd been in that meeting and it wasn't what happened, but no one would listen to him. He's—" Her voice steadied. "He has some difficulty with language now because of the surgery. It's harder to make people believe what he's saying when it takes longer to say it." Nora sat very still. "What you found," Lynn Hartley said, "is what Harold has been trying to say for 6 months. You gave it a language that people could hear." She paused. "He wanted me to call and tell you that someone heard what he was saying." Nora held the phone and looked at her spectrogram software, which was open on her monitor with a waveform on it, a different case, a different recording, but the same essential task. "Thank you," she said, "for calling. Tell him—" She paused. "Tell him I'm glad the record is clear." She hung up and sat at her desk for a long time without working. That evening, she told Whitfield about the call. They were in the kitchen of the Lincoln Square apartment, her kitchen, now their kitchen. The word "theirs" arriving in her vocabulary so gradually that she had not noticed when it became natural. He listened without speaking. "She said he'd been trying to say it for 6 months, Nora said, and couldn't make anyone hear it." He was quiet. "The recording that implicated me came from a meeting Harold Hartley attended. If the recording said what it appeared to say, it meant I'd spoken that way in front of a patient's family, which is not something I would do." He looked at the table. "I thought about him a lot in those months, whether he understood what was happening, whether any of it made any sense to him from where he was sitting. It apparently didn't make sense. He knew. A pause. "And couldn't get anyone to listen." She looked at him. "That's what the work is for," she said. "Not just the case. The patient who knew something was wrong and couldn't articulate it. That's what gets articulated." He met her gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yes, exactly that." They sat in the kitchen while May moved toward evening outside the gray stone windows, and the word exactly sat between them in the comfortable way of a word that has finally found its right context. The baby moved a decided, opinionated flutter that she had come to recognize as his version of registering that he was present in the conversation. "He agrees," she said. "He usually does," Whitfield said, and she recognized in his voice the note that had appeared sometime in February and had been getting steadily less guarded since the one that was his actual register underneath all the professional composure. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held hers carefully the way he held anything that mattered. Outside Lincoln Square went about its May evening. Inside, two people who had found each other through the most indirect possible route sat in their kitchen and let themselves be exactly where they were. June arrived, and with it the particular heat that Chicago imposed on itself with the conviction of a city that had earned it after 5 months of winter. The Lincoln Square graystone did what good old buildings did in heat, held the cool of the stone walls through the morning. Let the afternoon in slowly release the warmth back to the evening so that the windows left open caught whatever lake air moved through the neighborhood. Nora worked in the mornings when the air was still good. Her caseload had thinned by her own design. She had taken nothing new since February, letting the existing work wind down to the 3 cases she could manage without travel, without the kind of intensive field audio collection that required equipment she couldn't carry at 37 weeks. She had never slowed her professional life for anything before. She found to her mild surprise that the slowing did not feel like loss. It felt like a form of preparation, the same preparation she applied before any significant case, creating the right conditions to do the work well. The work that was coming was different from anything she had trained for, but the principle was the same. Whitfield had been operating for 5 months by then, fully restored his case schedule heavier than it had been before the suspension, because the hospital administration had, in some combination of institutional guilt and genuine appreciation for a department head who had handled 11 months of career destruction without publicly disintegrating, given him preferential scheduling for the complex cases he was best at. He came home tired in the way that surgeons came home tired, not depleted but compressed, the intensity of the operating room needing time to decompress before the evening could begin. She understood this without being told. She had been watching him long enough. His decompression ritual was cooking, which she had not anticipated and which had revealed itself gradually over 4 months of shared evenings. 20 minutes in the kitchen. Something simple, the repetitive physical process of chopping and heating and assembling, serving as the transition between the focused world of the operating room and the different focused world of the apartment. He never asked if she was hungry. He cooked for both of them as a matter of course, and she ate what he made because it was reliably good and because she had too many other things to think about to add meal planning to the list. "You cook because it quiets your brain," she said one evening watching him at the stove. "Neurosurgery requires a level of attention that's hard to sustain indefinitely," he said. "When the case is over, the attention has to go somewhere lower stakes. Most people use television. Television doesn't require the hands." He turned the heat down on something that smelled good. The hands need something to do. She thought about this. Her own decompression, she realized, was similar, not cooking, but the physical process of annotating printed spectrograms by hand, marking the areas her software had flagged with her own notation system. The hands engaged with something that didn't require the same kind of attention as the primary work. The brain decompressed through the subordinate task. "We're the same kind of person," she said. He looked over. "Yes," he said. "That's what I've been thinking since October." Her sister Dana came from Columbus in the second week of June, taking the 4-hour drive on a Friday after work and arriving at the Lincoln Square apartment with a bag full of things that Nora had not known she needed and a reaction to Whitfield that Nora had been quietly anticipating. Dana was 2 years younger, worked in hospital administration in Columbus, and had spent the past 8 months receiving periodic updates about the situation that Nora delivered in the form of logistical facts, rather than emotional narrative, because that was how Nora communicated important things, and Dana had long since learned to read between the logistical facts for the emotional content. Whitfield was home when Dana arrived, which was not by plan, but was not an accident either. Nora had mentioned the timing of her sister's arrival, and he had arranged to be done at the hospital by 5. He opened the door before Dana knocked, because he had been in the kitchen and had heard the car. Dana stood on the front step with her overnight bag and looked at him for a moment, and then looked at Nora, who was standing in the hallway. "Hi," Dana said to Whitfield. "Hi," he said. "You must be Dana. I'm James. Come in. Nora said you drove, so I made sure there was food." Dana came in. She set her bag down. She looked around the apartment, the workstation in the second bedroom visible through the open door, the framed spectrographic print on the wall, the kitchen where something was, in fact, on the stove. And then she looked at her sister. "You live here," she said. "We live here," Nora said. Dana sat at the kitchen table and accepted the glass of water that Whitfield offered without making it into a gesture, and watched him finish what he was making with the focused attention she'd developed in 2 years of hospital administration. The ability to assess a person through how they managed a physical space. After dinner, when Whitfield had cleared the table and gone to his side of the apartment to review the next day's case files, Dana said, "Okay, Nora agreed. "He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who needed more." Dana thought about it. "He doesn't need anything from you. He just wants to be in the same room. Yes, that's rare, Dana said. In my professional experience, that is genuinely rare. Nora looked toward the hallway where the light from the second bedroom was visible under the door. I know it is. Are you happy? She considered the question with the precision she applied to everything she decided. I'm in the right place, she said, doing the right work, with the right person. She paused. That's what happy means for me. That's the most Nora answer possible, Dana said, but I'll take it. The baby arrived on a Wednesday in late June, which was the week Nora had predicted. She had characteristically analyzed the data and determined a most probable window at 6:47 in the morning at Northwestern Memorial, after 12 hours that had been long in ways she had prepared for extensively, and that still managed to be different from the preparation in specific and overwhelming ways. Whitfield had been with her for all of it. He had not told her he would be there continuously. He had simply been there continuously. In the quiet, sustained way that she had come to understand was his version of the most fundamental commitment he knew how to make. Dr. Rhodes managed the room with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times and knew that the room belonged to the patient, not to the medical team. The baby she had known since the anatomy scan had not fully processed since the anatomy scan and was now fully processing in the way that could not be prepared for arrived into the world with the decisive conviction of someone who had decided he was done waiting. Whitfield cut the cord. His hands were steady. She watched his face when he did it. She had seen his professional face in photographs and in the conference room. She had seen his thinking face at the kitchen table and his tired face at the end of long OR days and his careful face in the early months when he was being precise about not overstepping. She had not seen this face before, the face of a man who was encountering something that existed entirely outside any category of experience he had previously possessed. The baby was placed on her chest. She had thought in the analytical portion of her brain that never fully stopped that she would be surprised by the reality of him, that the abstract fact of pregnancy would collide with the concrete fact of an actual person and produce some kind of dissonance. But there was no dissonance. There was only him specific present, entirely himself, with a face she could read already, even though she had known him for 43 seconds. Hi, she said very quietly. He stopped crying. Not for long he had opinions and announced them, but for 1 second, hearing her voice, he stopped. He knows you, Whitfield said beside her. He should, she said. I've been talking to him for months. She looked up at Whitfield, then properly with the attention she brought to things that mattered. His eyes were not the controlled gray-blue of the conference room or the focused gray-blue of the operating suite. They were something else, open in the way that only happened when a person was completely in the present moment and had stopped managing the distance. Theo, she said. She had chosen the name alone months ago and had told him, and he had said it was right without elaboration, which was how she had known he meant it. Theo, he repeated. She held their son and let the hospital room be the hospital room, full of the specific sounds and lights of a place where significant things happened constantly, and this particular significant thing was happening right now, and she did not reach for any framework or analysis or conclusion. She just let it be what it was, which was, she would think later, the things she had been slowly learning since October, that not everything required a conclusion. Some things were sufficient exactly as they were. The first month after Theo arrived had the quality of deep water, not turbulent, but fully immersive, the ordinary world visible from inside it, but at a remove. Nora had prepared for this. She had read the literature on postpartum adjustment with the same methodical attention she brought to pre-trial preparation. Sleep deprivation protocols, hormonal shifts, and their cognitive effects. The reorganization of priority hierarchies that occurred when a new person entered a household and immediately restructured everything around their own requirements. None of the literature had fully captured Theo. Theo had opinions from the first hours about position, about noise, about the temperature of the room, about the specific angle at which he wanted to be held during the 3 a.m. interval that had rapidly become his most communicative period. He was specific in a way that startled her. Not an infant generically, but this infant with this face and this particular style of making his needs known, which was comprehensive and unhesitating and bore a resemblance to her own professional directness that she found both charming and slightly alarming. Whitfield was present through all of it, not present in the managed, scheduled way she had worried about, the way that would have felt like a performance of co-parenting rather than the thing itself. Present the way he was present in surgery, she thought fully with the specific attention of someone who had eliminated distractions, not by ignoring them, but by understanding what mattered most and organizing everything else around it. He took the 3 to 6 shift. He had determined this empirically after the first week by noting that those particular hours hit Nora the hardest, that her capacity for the specific patients of early infant care was functionally impaired between 3 and 6 in a way that it was not at midnight or at 9 a.m., and had adjusted accordingly without announcement or discussion. She found out what he was doing when she woke at 3:15 on a Thursday to silence and realized she had slept through the usual interval. She came to the doorway of the nursery. He was in the chair they'd bought for it. Theo against his chest, speaking in a low voice. Not words exactly, just the texture of voice that Theo had demonstrated a preference for. The room was dim. The east-facing window was still dark. She went back to bed and slept until 7. "You didn't tell me you were doing that," she said in the morning. "You were tired," he said. "You should have told me. Would you have let me if I'd asked?" She considered this. Probably not immediately. "The 3 to 6 shift is mine," he said, "unless you want it back." "I don't want it back," she said. "I'm telling you to communicate these things." "All right." He looked at her. "The 3 to 6 shift is mine. I'm communicating that now." "Thank you. You're welcome." She went back to her coffee and he went back to whatever case notes he was reviewing, and Theo slept in the portable crib in the corner with the absolute commitment of someone who had done his work for the night. Dana came back in August, this time for a week. She sat in the kitchen with Theo in her arms and watched Nora at the workstation and said after a while, "You look like yourself." "I've always looked like myself." "You look like yourself and something else." "That's what I mean." Dana adjusted Theo's position. He had the alert assessing quality when awake that both of them had begun to note as characteristic, the eyes moving over a room with the focused attention of someone gathering information. "He has your eyes." "The shape is James's. The quality is yours." Dana watched him watch her. "He's going to be a lot." "He already is," Nora said. "Are you ready for that?" Nora saved the file she was working on and turned her chair. "I'm ready for whatever he is," she said. "I don't need him to be easy. I need him to be himself." Dana looked at her for a moment. "James says things like that. Does he—" "When I talked to him yesterday while you were on the call, he said I don't remember exactly something about how Theo had already demonstrated that he was going to do things on his own terms, and that was the most he could hope for." She paused. He sounded proud. Nora turned back to her workstation. "He is," she said. And then, because Dana was looking at her in the specific way that required honesty, "So am I." The formal Dermot proceedings reached their conclusion in September. The Illinois IDFPR investigation had moved with the particular thoroughness of a regulatory process that had been handed airtight forensic evidence and needed to build the surrounding case to match. By August, Dermot had retained a second attorney. By September, his first attorney had withdrawn. The negotiations that followed were conducted at arm's length from Nora. She had submitted her report. It had been incorporated into the formal record, and the rest was the machinery of professional accountability operating as it was designed to. Casey called on a Tuesday with the outcome: voluntary surrender of hospital privileges at Northwestern, a consent agreement with the licensing board supervised practice, reduced scope, the structural consequence of having been caught doing something specific and serious. Not disbarment from medicine entirely, which Nora had expected to feel some ambiguity about and did not. The consent agreement was appropriate. The supervision was appropriate. What he had done to Whitfield was serious and was being taken seriously. What he had done in the operating room was a different question being handled through separate proceedings. "Done," Casey said. "Your report is in the formal record." His attorney tried twice more to challenge the methodology and failed both times. "I know. I read the filings." "Of course you did." A pause. "How's Theo?" 11 weeks and extremely opinionated. Like his mother. "I've heard that theory." She told Whitfield that evening. He was at the stove. Pasta Wednesday pasta had become its own category, and he turned when she came into the kitchen. "Dermot," she said, "the consent agreement. You heard. The hospital administrator sent me the summary this morning." He turned back to the stove. "It's the right outcome." "Is it enough?" He was quiet for a moment, stirring. "For what I lost, no. For the system, yes. Those are different questions." He looked over. I spent a lot of time in those months wanting something that wasn't the right outcome, wanting it to be more, to be worse for him. He paused. I'm not going to pretend the consent agreement feels like justice in the full sense. What does it feel like? The correct technical response to a documented error, he said. Which is what it is. He turned fully from the stove. The thing that actually feels like something is Harold Hartley's attorney calling 2 weeks ago to say that the evidence from my case is being incorporated into the civil suit for Harold's damages. That his family has a clearer path to the compensation they need. He held her gaze. That feels like something. She thought about Lynn Hartley's phone call in May, about Harold Hartley who had known and couldn't get anyone to hear him. That's the right thing to feel, she said. I know. He went back to the pasta. And the consent agreement is the right professional outcome. I can hold both. She sat at the table. Theo, in the baby seat they had set up in the kitchen corner because he was at the age where he required the room to come to him, rather than the other way around, registered her presence with his usual focused assessment, and then returned his attention to the specific square of afternoon light on the kitchen floor that had apparently been of interest to him all afternoon. James, she said. Yeah. What you said last January about wanting to build something rather than manage it at arm's length. He turned again. I think we're building it, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, I know we are. He said it with the specific certainty of the surgical suite, not the performance of certainty, but the real thing, the kind that came from having looked at something long enough to see it clearly. I've known it since April. April is specific. The day we painted the nursery, he said. You didn't want anyone in there making decisions without you. And I hadn't asked, I'd just shown up with the right equipment. And instead of telling me to go, you picked up a roller. He paused. That was the day I knew. She thought about that Saturday, the painter who had handed them rollers and gone to lunch, the lake gray paint, the two of them working in the silence that wasn't uncomfortable. I didn't know what I was deciding, she said. I know. That's why it was real. October arrived with the specific beauty of Chicago autumn. The trees along Lincoln Square doing what the trees did, the lake visible on clear days as a brightness at the end of certain streets, the air with the edge of what was coming, but not yet committed to it. Theo was 4 months and conducting a systematic investigation of his own hands, which had recently revealed themselves as objects of significant interest. He could push up on his arms during tummy time with the determination of someone who understood the goal and had no patience for the timeline. He made sounds that were increasingly specific, not words, but the architecture of language being assembled from available materials. Nora had returned to full caseload in September. Not the volume she'd carried before June, she had made deliberate choices about what she was taking on and what she wasn't, in a way that was new for her and that she was still calibrating. She had turned down 2 cases that would have required extended travel. She had taken 3 that she could manage from the workstation in the second bedroom with the door closed and Whitfield managing Theo in the mornings, and the door open in the afternoons so she could hear him through the wall. The hearing through the wall. Theo's sounds from the kitchen or the living room. Whitfield's voice responding. She had not realized before this arrangement that she would find that specific ambient sound productive rather than distracting, but she did. It was, she thought, the auditory equivalent of having a window. Not something she was paying attention to, but something that oriented her in space. She was in the middle of a new case, a corporate whistleblower matter recorded meetings alleged to have been doctored to suppress discrimination evidence when Casey Park called with something that was not a case referral. I've been approached by a legal aid clinic on the South Side, Casey said. They do employment discrimination and domestic violence work primarily. They're trying to build out their forensic capacity. They have cases that involve audio evidence and no one on staff who can analyze it. That's a staffing problem, Nora said, not a consulting model. They don't want staff. They want a consulting relationship with someone who will take cases on a sliding scale, work with their attorneys, and potentially train their paralegals on basic audio authentication. A pause. I told them I knew someone. Nora set down her pen. She had been thinking since the Hartley phone call in May about what Lynn Hartley had said about giving language to what someone couldn't articulate, about the gap between knowing something was wrong and being able to prove it. That gap was where she worked professionally. It was also she had been slowly realizing the specific gap that appeared most often in cases where people lacked resources, where the person who knew was not the person who could afford to establish what they knew, in a legally actionable form. Send me their information, she said. I will. Casey paused. This would be different from your usual work. I know. Lower fees, more client-facing than you typically are. The attorneys you'd work with are junior. Casey. Yeah. Send me the information. She met with the clinic director on a Thursday afternoon while Whitfield had Theo. The director was a woman named Patricia Owens, who ran a staff of 12 in a building on Garfield Boulevard that had the organized, controlled energy of a place that was doing a great deal with limited resources and had long since made peace with that as the operating condition. Owens explained what they needed with precision cases involving recorded conversations alleged to have been altered by employers, by abusers, by landlords, where the authenticity of the recording was being used as a weapon against the person it was supposed to protect. Cases where the resources to properly authenticate audio were not available to the people who needed that authentication most. I can work on a sliding scale, Nora said. I'll need to be selective about volume. I have a caseload that takes precedence, but I can commit to a minimum of 4 cases per quarter. That would change what we're able to do, Owen said. The training component, I'll need to know more about your paralegal's technical background before I design anything. Variable, we can work around it. The cases you send me, I need full access to the primary source audio. I can't analyze copies of copies. Understood. Nora looked at the woman across the desk, the organized efficiency, the absence of self-pity about working conditions, the directness that she recognized as the particular directness of someone who had learned that time spent managing other people's comfort was time taken from the work. Send me the first case, she said. We'll see how it works. She told Whitfield about it over dinner. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when something mattered, the full attention, without the interjections that signaled only partial processing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You've been moving toward this since May, he said, since the Hartley call. Even before that. The way you talked about Harold Hartley in January, you cared about the specific case in a way that went beyond the technical work. The technical work serves the specific case, she said. That's always been true. Not at the level you're describing now. He looked at her. You're not just doing the analysis, you're building something around it. She thought about what Casey had said, building out forensic capacity, about Owens's phrase changes what we're able to do, about the specific gap between knowing and being able to prove which was where she worked and where it mattered most. Maybe, she said, I'm trying something. I'll know more in 6 months. I know you'll know more in 6 months, he said. That's how you work. He held her gaze. For what it's worth, this is what you're supposed to be doing. You told me in October that you developed a particular kind of listening. This is what that listening is for. She looked at him. You're very certain of things about me. I've been paying attention for a year. He was direct about it the way he was always direct about things that were true. You don't miss what matters. She held that for a moment. Neither do you, she said. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his actual face. Not the surgical composure or the professional precision, but what was underneath those, the specific look of a person who was completely present in the right place and knew it. No, he said, not anymore. Theo, from his bouncy seat at the end of the table, announced something that was not yet language, but was clearly a contribution to the conversation. Both of them looked at him. He agrees, Whitfield said. He always agrees when we're both in the room, she said. He's been doing that since the hospital. He knows when the right people are present. He knows when all of his world is in the room, she said. That's different. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then, that's exactly it. November brought the first serious cold, and Theo's discovery of his feet, which occupied him with the same methodical intensity he brought to his hands, and which Nora had begun to accept as his characteristic mode. Systematic, thorough, apparently immune to frustration when the thing being examined did not immediately yield its secrets. He gets that from you, Whitfield said, watching him. The feet. The patience. He'll stare at something for 10 minutes. You do that. I'm paid to stare at things. You do it with everything, not just work. He looked at her. You stared at the lease for 4 days before signing it. I read it carefully. You read it in 2 hours. You stared at it for 4 days. She had in fact stared at the lease for 4 days. What she had been staring at was not the legal language. I was deciding something, she said. I know what you were deciding. You didn't say anything. I was deciding to let you decide. He turned back to Theo. The waiting was its own kind of answer. If you hadn't been willing to decide, I needed to know that too. She looked at the side of his face, The careful profile, the hands in his lap, that were still the surgeon's hands, but wore them differently now, in this context, without the professional distance. She had found a photograph of him online in the early days of the case before she had met him. And even in the photograph, the hands were the distinguishing feature, the kind of hands that accumulated significance through what they could do. "I've been thinking about the next lease," she said. He turned. "This one is up in May," she said. "I've been thinking about what makes sense." "What are you thinking?" "The building 3 streets over has a unit on the first floor, bigger than this one. The second bedroom is large enough to actually separate the workspace and the nursery, which we should have done from the beginning. We made the best decision we had the information for at the time." "I know, I'm saying the next decision has more information." She met his gaze. "There's also a third bedroom." He was very still. "I'm not making a declaration," she said. "I'm opening a conversation about whether what we've been building here is something we want to make more permanent, and what permanent looks like for 2 people who both value their autonomy and their work, and have a child who is currently trying to eat his own feet." Whitfield looked at Theo, who was in fact attempting to accomplish exactly this with full commitment. Then he looked at Nora. "The building 3 streets over," he said. "It's a graystone, same vintage as this one, better kitchen. You've already been inside." "I looked at the listing." She paused. "I may have called the landlord." "Of course you have." He said it with the expression she had been watching develop for a year, the one that appeared when she did something exactly as he expected her to do it, which was its own form of being known. "The third bedroom. For when Dana comes, or for whatever else we need it to be." "For whatever else we need it to be," he repeated. "Yes?" He turned fully toward her. "What are you not saying directly?" She had been trained to notice what people weren't saying. She recognized it in herself now, too, the things circling the statement without landing. "I'm saying I want to stay," she said, "in the form we've built. I want to make it more permanent. I'm not ready for every word that implies, but I'm ready for the commitment behind it." The stillness in him was the specific stillness of someone receiving something they'd been waiting for and had not known exactly how to wait for correctly. "The third bedroom," he said. "Yes." "Call the landlord," he said. "We'll go see it this weekend." She nodded. Theo, having reached a conclusion about his feet, looked up at both of them with the specific assessment he brought to all situations, taking inventory, determining whether the room had what it needed, registering satisfaction. He made a sound that would eventually be a word and wasn't yet. "He's with us," Whitfield said. "He's always with us," Nora said. "That's the deal he made." She reached out and put her hand over Whitfield's on the table. He turned his hand and held hers carefully, with the hands that had done 10,000 precise things and were learning a new set of precise things in a different register for different stakes. Outside, November was doing what November in Chicago did. Inside the apartment on Lincoln Square was warm and specific, and already not quite what they'd made of it, already becoming something with a forward edge. That was, she thought, exactly right. They moved in February. The graystone on Levitt was everything the listing had suggested, and the first visit had confirmed high ceilings, the bones of a century-old building that had been maintained with respect rather than renovated into submission, a kitchen that was actually a kitchen and not a corridor with appliances. The third bedroom faced south and got the afternoon light, which Whitfield noted would be useful for whoever used it, whether that was Dana visiting from Columbus or anything else they had not yet named. The second bedroom was large enough to create a proper division between Theo's nursery side and Nora's workstation side, with a bookcase as the functional border. She built the bookcase herself on a Saturday afternoon, while Whitfield kept Theo in the living room and ran case notes. He came in twice to offer help. Both times she declined because she had a system, and the system required her to execute it. He brought her coffee once and did not comment on the fact that the system took 40% longer than the estimated time on the assembly instructions. She noticed he did not comment. "You've stopped trying to fix timelines," she said that evening. "Your timelines always land where they need to," he said. "I just had to wait long enough to establish that." "How long did that take?" "About 6 weeks after we moved in together." He looked up from his reading. "There was the grocery incident." She remembered the grocery incident. She had spent 40 minutes in the produce section making decisions that, by his account, did not require 40 minutes. He had in that early period suggested a more efficient approach. She had explained that efficiency was not the relevant variable in the produce section and that she was going to continue taking the time the process required. He had not suggested a more efficient approach again. "You learned faster than I expected," she said. I'm a quick study when the subject is important. She went back to the file she was reviewing. Outside February was being February uncompromising and extended, and the south-facing windows of the new apartment were doing the thing she had been told they would do, which was hold enough of the thin winter light to make the room feel like there was more of it than there was. Theo 8 months now, and conducting himself with the mobility of someone who had determined that the world was better explored from a position of constant low-level physical effort, navigated the living room with the focused determination he brought to all motor development. He had not walked yet. He had found crawling so efficient that he appeared to regard walking as an unnecessary complication, but he pulled himself to standing on every available surface with the systematic confidence of someone who was preparing for something and was on schedule. The Garfield Boulevard Clinic sent its second case in February and its third in March. Nora worked on them in the mornings with the door to the nursery side of the second bedroom closed, and the specific sounds of Whitfield managing Theo in the kitchen providing the ambient grounding she had come to depend on. The cases were different from her usual work, smaller, less technically complex, but with a quality of consequence that was not smaller. A recording of a landlord's conversation allegedly edited to remove a discriminatory statement, a voicemail from an employer that had been submitted as evidence of misconduct, the original having been altered before submission. She found what she needed to find. She wrote reports that Patricia Owens's paralegals could use in proceedings where the other side had significantly more resources. She began a training document for the paralegal staff, a practical guide to audio authentication basics. What questions to ask a forensic analyst how to preserve chain of custody for audio evidence. It was not the kind of document she would have written 18 months ago when her work had been entirely in the space of high-stakes litigation with well-funded parties. It was more useful. Casey called in March to say that a second legal aid organization had contacted her. They had heard about the Garfield Clinic arrangement. Word travels, Casey said. It's a specific gap, Nora said. Organizations that work in this space have audio evidence problems and no resources to address them. You're going to end up with more of this than you planned for. Probably. She looked at her caseload. I'll need to think about structure. You always think about structure. That's because structure is what makes things work. She was thinking about structure for the next 3 weeks, the shape of something that could handle multiple clinic relationships without becoming something she couldn't sustain alongside her primary caseload, a consulting framework with clear intake criteria, a training component that could be delivered to multiple organizations, a fee structure that allowed sliding scale for the clinic work without compromising the rates that funded everything else. She sketched the framework on a Wednesday evening at the kitchen table after dinner. Whitfield was reading across from her. Theo was asleep. The apartment was in the specific quiet of a weeknight that had been productive and was now allowing itself to be still. What are you building? Whitfield asked, not looking up. A structure, she said. For what? For the clinic work. It's growing faster than I planned, and I need a framework before it grows past what I can manage informally. He looked up then. How large are you thinking? Not large. I'm not trying to build an organization. I'm trying to make the consulting sustainable. She turned the notepad toward him. A clear intake process, standardized fee tiers, a training curriculum I can deliver once, an update rather than building from scratch for each organization. He looked at it. He asked 2 questions, both the right questions, the ones that probed the structural weaknesses she had already identified and was working on. She answered them. This is what you were doing in May, he said, when you called the Garfield Clinic. Before May, the Hartley call was the moment I understood what I'd been circling toward. You knew before you knew. The instinct was there. The form took longer. She took the notepad back. That's always how it works. He looked at her across the table, the evening kitchen, the February light through the windows, the specific, comfortable domesticity of 2 people in a room that had become genuinely theirs. You're going to be known for this, he said, not just the high-stakes work. This. I'm known for what I do, she said, not for the framing around it. The framing matters to the people it reaches, he said. The woman whose landlord tried to alter the recording, your name matters to her in a specific way. She thought about that. About Lynn Hartley calling in May to say that someone had heard what her husband had been trying to say. About the specific quality of being heard when you've been unable to make yourself audible. It's the same work, she said, at different scales. Yes, he said. That's exactly what makes it important. April brought the anniversary of the conference room on Michigan Avenue, where she had first walked through her findings for Whitfield's legal team, which she did not note in any particular way except to find herself thinking about it on a Tuesday morning while running the Garfield Clinic's newest case. 1 year from the first conference room to this, Theo in the nursery side of the bedroom, audible through the bookcase, engaged in conversation with whoever was providing his morning supervision. Whitfield at Northwestern, scheduled in the OR until 2. The workstation running a spectrographic analysis. The clinic file open beside it. The apartment organized around all of these things, in the way that a space organized itself when it was actually being used. She was not the same person who had sat in that conference room in October. She had known then that the case was important and that her analysis was correct, and those had been the facts she was managing. She had not known that the specific focused attention of the man at the end of the table, the 3 questions in 2 hours, the gray-blue eyes that landed rather than swept, was going to prove to be the kind of attention that once you'd been in proximity to it, you understood differently the shape of your life before it. She was not someone who thought about things in those terms. She was aware that she was thinking about this one in those terms and filed it as data. Whitfield came home at 2:30. She heard him in the kitchen, the specific sounds of his decompression routine water the refrigerator, the familiar sequence. Then he appeared in the doorway of the workstation side with a cup of coffee and looked at her. "Good day?" she asked. "Complicated case? Good outcome." He came in and sat in the chair she'd added specifically so he could be in the room without interrupting the work. "How's the Garfield case?" He halt. "Easier than I expected. The editing is crude. Whoever altered it didn't know what they were doing." Is crude editing easier or harder to document? Easier to find, harder to explain to a non-expert. The artifact pattern is less consistent. She turned her monitor toward him. "This is a comparison view, clean recording on the left, altered on the right. The discontinuities are visible even without the spectral analysis." He leaned in and looked. He could read spectrograms now, not at her level, but enough to know what he was looking at. She had shown him over the course of a year, and he had learned with the same methodical patience he brought to everything new. "The right side," he said. 3 points where the waveform interrupts in a way that doesn't match the ambient noise pattern. "That's the edit." "That's the edit." He sat back. "You make this look simple. The finding is never simple. The documentation has just become fluent." She turned the monitor back. "After enough cases, the fluency looks like simplicity. Like surgery," he said. "Like surgery." She kept her eyes on the screen. "There's something I want to say." He was quiet. "Last October, when you came over after the restoration and said what you said about wanting to build this rather than manage it at arm's length." She turned toward him. "I said certain enough. As in I was certain enough for action." "I remember. I'm more certain now." She held his gaze. "That's all. I wanted to say it directly because I don't say things like that often, and when I mean them, I should say them." The quality of his silence was the one she had learned to read as its own kind of response. The full attention stillness of someone receiving something and holding it correctly. "I know," he said finally. "I've known for a while." He looked at her with the expression that was his actual face, the one underneath all the others. "I was waiting for you to know it. I knew it in February," she said. "I was verifying." "And now," verified, she said, "reproducible and documentable." He made the sound that had become his version of a laugh interior, not performed, reaching his eyes. "I love you," he said. Not as a response to what she'd said, but as its own statement offered simply without architecture. She looked at him. "I know," she said. And then because he deserved the directness he had always given her, "I love you too. I've known since January. I was being careful." "You're always careful. It's a professional asset." In this context, he said, "It's also fine. I was waiting." "I know you were." She turned back to her work. "You're good at waiting. I've had practice." He stood, coffee in hand. "I'll get Theo from the sitter. He's been with Mrs. Kowalski since noon, and she has a 4 o'clock. Tell him I'll be done in an hour." "I'll tell him." He paused at the doorway. "He'll be glad." She listened to him leave the room, heard the apartment's specific quiet settle back in his absence, and returned to the spectrogram on her screen, the crude edit, the visible discontinuity, the truth embedded in a recording that someone had tried to alter and had not altered well enough. She found it. She marked it. She wrote the first line of the documentation. That was the work. It had always been the work. The finding and the naming and the making available to people who needed it, what had been hidden from them. She thought exactly where she was supposed to be. May arrived with the particular ambition of a Chicago spring that had been held back by a long winter and was now making up for lost time, the trees along Levitt, going green overnight. The lake doing something startling on clear mornings, the whole city adjusting its posture toward the warmth, with the relief of somewhere that had been through something and come out the other side. Theo turned one on a Wednesday. There was no party in the elaborate sense, a gathering of 11 people in the south-facing living room of the Levitt Greystone. The afternoon light doing exactly what they'd been told it would do when they took the apartment in February. Dana having made the drive from Columbus again, and this time staying 4 days. Patricia Owens from the Garfield Clinic came, which had surprised Nora when Whitfield suggested inviting her, and had stopped surprising her when she thought about it, because Owens was someone who was doing significant work and had become, without formal declaration, someone Nora considered part of the landscape of her professional life. Casey came. Dr. Rhodes came and looked at Theo with the professional satisfaction of someone who had delivered him and was pleased with how he was turning out. A colleague of Whitfield's from Northwestern, a trauma surgeon named Marcus Webb, who had been Nora, had learned one of the people who had not treated Whitfield differently during the administrative leave and who had therefore earned a particular form of loyalty. Theo moved through his birthday gathering with the methodical focus he brought to all social environments. Systematic assessment, selective engagement, complete comfort in his own priorities. He was walking now, the late decision having apparently been made on a Tuesday in April, without announcement, and he navigated the apartment with the specific efficiency of someone who had evaluated all available modes of transportation and selected the optimal one. "He's so much like you," Dana said to Nora, watching him. "I've heard that. Does it bother you?" "No." Nora watched her son accept a piece of birthday cake with the serious attention he gave to all food evaluations. "It means I understand what he needs. And what James needs." She glanced at Whitfield across the room. He was in conversation with Marcus Webb, present in the room, in the way that was by now simply his way of being the full attention that had become familiar. "He needs different things," she said. "That's useful." "Different how?" "He needs to process before he talks about things. I talk to process." She looked at Dana. "We've had to learn to wait for each other." "Has that been hard?" "Some of it." She was honest because Dana knew when she wasn't being honest. "The first months were harder than I expected. Not because anything was wrong, because I'm not practiced at being in close proximity to someone who matters to me. I kept expecting things to break. But they didn't. They didn't." She picked up her glass. "They bent occasionally. We both had to adjust things that had worked fine for us alone. But they didn't break." Dana was quiet for a moment. "You seem settled." "I am settled." She thought about what that meant, not static, not without difficulty, but grounded. In the right place. The work. The clinic cases. The training curriculum. We submitted the first version last month. She looked at her son, who had reached a conclusion about birthday cake, and moved on to investigating the corner of the room near the window where the afternoon light was doing something interesting on the floor. "Theo, James," she paused. "All of it." Dana followed her gaze to Whitfield, who had noticed Theo's investigation of the light, and was watching him with the expression that had become over the course of a year, simply the expression he wore when Theo was in the room, the full specific attention unhurried. "He doesn't stop watching him," Dana said. "No." Nora agreed. "He doesn't." The summer was the summer of two things: Theo's developing language and the formal structure of what would eventually be called the Forensic Audio Access Project. On the Theo front, he had words before summer, and sentences by July, arriving at language with the same systematic completeness he brought to everything else. Not many words at a time, but precise, he did not approximate when accuracy was available. He said more when he wanted more. He said down when he wanted to be put down. He said that, and pointed with the focused insistence of someone who understood that communication was the transfer of specific information and that imprecision wasted everyone's time. "He's going to be a lawyer," Dana said on a video call from Columbus. "He's going to be himself," Nora said. "That's what worries me," Dana said, and she was smiling when she said it. On the project front, what had begun as an informal consulting arrangement with the Garfield Clinic had been formalized in May, joined by 2 additional legal aid organizations in June, and was operating with enough volume by July that Nora had drafted the structural document she had been building since March, and shared it with Casey Owens and 2 other people whose judgment she trusted about whether the framework would hold. The framework was not an organization. She had been deliberate about this. She was not trying to build something with employees and overhead and an executive director and board meetings. She was trying to build something sustainable, a consulting network with clear criteria for intake, a training curriculum that could be delivered at scale, and a fee structure that funded the sliding scale clinic work through the full-rate commercial work. A practice, not a nonprofit, the kind of thing that could outlast any individual grant cycle and didn't require an annual gala to fund. Casey called it the most Nora version of a good idea possible. Whitfield called it exactly right, which she noted as the most useful thing he could have said. She worked on it in the mornings. In the afternoons, she was Theo's primary, while Whitfield was at the hospital, which meant sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, while Theo conducted his independent investigations in the adjacent living room, navigating toward her when he had a finding to report, and away from her when the finding had been processed and the next investigation had begun. She found as she had not expected to find that she liked this. Not despite the interruptions, but because of the specific quality of the interruptions, the small weight of a child arriving at her knee with the discovery, the brief shared attention, the departure. It was its own form of ambient sound, not continuous, not demanding of sustained focus, but orienting, reminding her in the regular intervals between sections of work that the work was happening inside a life, and the life was the point. She had not before Theo thought of herself as someone who needed to be reminded of that. She had thought of herself as someone for whom the work was sufficient. It was not that the work had become insufficient, it was that the life had become larger, and the work fit inside it differently, and the fit was better. She told Whitfield this on a July evening, which was the kind of evening Chicago produced in July, warm past dark, the lake nearby, in the specific way you could feel without being able to see it. The apartment doors opened to whatever air moved through. He listened. He said, "I think about that too. About the work fitting differently. About the work having a context that makes it make sense in a way it didn't before." He looked at Theo, who was asleep in the monitor at the end of the kitchen table, the sound of his breathing audible in the quiet. "I've been a surgeon for 14 years. I've always known why I do it. I understood the reason. But the reason used to live in the abstract. Now it lives in the specific. The specific being," he glanced at the monitor. "Him, you, the clinic case you told me about last week, the woman whose employer tried to erase what she said. The reason I do difficult work under pressure used to be professional. Now it's also personal. Those are different motivations," she said. "They reinforce each other," he said. "That's what I didn't expect." He looked at her. "You were the first thing that made the work feel personal, not instead of professional in addition to." She sat with that. It was the kind of statement she would have deflected a year ago. Too exposed, too much. Like the declaration she had taught herself to be careful about. She didn't deflect it now. "You were the thing that made me understand the clinic work," she said. "Not because of what you went through, although that was part of it. Because watching you in that conference room, knowing what was at stake and watching you ask the right questions anyway, that showed me what it looked like when someone did the difficult thing correctly. I wanted to be the person who helped more people do that." He looked at her steadily. "You are." "I'm building it," she said. "There's a difference." "There's less difference than you think," he said. September brought the one-year anniversary of the Dermot consent agreement, which neither of them marked directly, and the beginning of Theo's second year, which they marked with a trip to the Ohio coast. Dana's suggestion, seconded by Whitfield, who had never been to the Lake Erie shore and had researched it with the thoroughness he applied to unfamiliar topics, and reported that it was in its specific Midwestern way genuinely worth seeing. They drove. 11 hours with a one-year-old, which Nora had prepared for, with the methodical attention she gave to anything that involved uncertainty and time pressure, and which had been approximately 70% as difficult as her modeling had predicted, and 30% something she hadn't modeled, the specific pleasure of being in a car for a long time with people she wanted to be in a car with. Theo, strapped in the back with his current collection of favorite objects, narrated the entire drive in the developing language that was becoming daily more recognizable and remained daily a complete surprise. He said tree when he saw trees, which was frequently in Indiana. He said truck with great enthusiasm when trucks passed. At some point in western Ohio, he said something that sounded like home in reference to nothing visible from his window, which both Nora and Whitfield heard and neither immediately addressed, looking straight ahead on the highway. "He's been saying that for a week," Whitfield said finally. "I know," she said. "He says it in the apartment when we come back from somewhere. He kept his eyes on the road. When both of us are in the same room. She looked at the road ahead. He knows what he means. Yes. They drove. The Lake Erie shore near Geneva, where Dana had rented a house for the week, was exactly what Whitfield's research had described: a wide, flat shoreline with a different quality of light than the Michigan side, quieter the water, a gray-green that changed with the cloud cover and the time of day. Theo met the lake with the same systematic attention he brought to everything new, standing at the water's edge, with Whitfield's hand in both of his, watching the waves arrive and recede, not afraid assessing. He's counting, Nora said. He's determining the pattern, Whitfield said. Same thing. Dana arrived Saturday, and they had the specific easy week of people who know each other well enough to be in the same space without managing it. Walks along the shore, meals in the house that rotated, who cooked and who cleaned, long evenings on the porch where the lake was audible in the dark. And Theo eventually went to sleep on whoever's lap was available. One evening, when Dana had gone in and Theo was asleep between them on the porch swing, Nora said, "I think about the first meeting a lot." "Which one?" Whitfield asked. "October, the conference room, your 3 questions." He looked at her. "I filed them immediately," she said, "as data. I didn't know what category to put them in, too specific for professional, too early for anything else. So I just filed them." She looked at the dark water. "I keep taking them back out." "What do you do with them now?" "I know what category they belong to." She shifted Theo slightly. He was heavy in sleep, the dense, specific weight of a child who trusted entirely where he was. "The category is the moment I understood what kind of attention I was dealing with." "And what kind was it?" "The kind that's looking for what's actually there," she said. "Not what should be there, not what's expected. What's actually there." He was quiet for a moment. "You said that in the conference room. Almost exactly." "I know. You responded to it." "I'd been listening to that kind of attention my whole professional life," he said, "and failing to find it in anything personal. It was disorienting in October, to encounter it in a context I hadn't expected." "It was October for me too," she said. "I wasn't expecting any of it." He reached over and put his hand on hers where it rested on Theo's back. She turned her hand and held his. The lake made its sounds in the dark. Theo breathed. The week was winding down toward the drive back to Chicago, to the Greystone on Levitt, to the workstation and the OR schedule and the clinic cases, and all the specific, ordinary things that constituted the actual fabric of what they were building. "I want to ask you something," Whitfield said. "All right. Not about logistics, not about the framework or the apartment or anything structural." He turned to look at her. "I want to ask whether you want to make this permanent, in the formal sense. Whatever form that takes, I'm not prescribing the form. I'm asking whether it's something you want." She had not been expecting it in that moment on the porch by the lake with their sleeping son between them, and the not expecting made it more real than it would have been if she'd been prepared for it. She thought about the lease in April, the bookcase she'd built herself, the 3rd bedroom she'd mentioned first, which she'd mentioned because she knew what she was saying and had chosen to say it in the language she trusted, the language of practical decisions that contained the personal declaration inside them. "Yes," she said, "in whatever form makes sense for us. Not the conventional form necessarily. I'm not asking for the conventional form." She looked at him. "I'm asking for what's true, which is that I want to be with you, and I want Theo to know that this is what his family looks like, and I don't care particularly what we call it as long as it's real." "I have the same want," he said, "and the same indifference to what we call it." "Then we agree." "We agree." He looked at Theo asleep between them with the absolute trust of someone who had decided his world was safe. "We could get married," he said, "or we could not. Either one I'm equally committed to." "Neither of us particularly needs the form," she said. "No, but Theo might someday, for the clarity of it." "He might," he considered. "Small, no event planner. Something that's ours rather than something for an audience." "If we do it," she said. "If we do it," he agreed. "There's no rush." "There never has been." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "We're already in it." "We've been in it since April," he said, "of last year." "I thought it was October." "October was the conference room," he said. "April was when you picked up the paint roller." She was quiet for a moment. Then, because it was accurate, and she had decided that accurate was always worth saying, "I knew in October, I was processing in April." He made the interior sound that was his version of amusement. 12 years of surgical training," he said. and you're the most precise person I've ever met. It's a professional asset. It's also just you, he said. They sat on the porch with their son between them while the Ohio lake did what it did in the September dark, and the week wound down around them, and neither of them hurried it toward anything, because the thing they were in was already the thing, already the specific daily life they had built from a conference room in October, and a 43-second recording, and a frequency artifact that only one person's ear had been trained to hear. The next morning, Theo woke at 6 and said home, clearly looking at both of them in a sentence structure that was not yet a sentence but was unmistakably a statement of orientation. Not yet, Whitfield told him. 2 more days. Theo appeared to accept this with equanimity, assessed the morning light in the unfamiliar room, and moved on to the next investigation. Nora watched this from the doorway and thought, this is the evidence. Not the formal kind, not reproducible, not documentable, not the kind that holds up in court. The other kind, the daily accumulating evidence of a life that has organized itself around the right things and knows it. She had been listening for that evidence since October. She had found it. October again, a full year from the conference room on Michigan Avenue. Nora did not mark the anniversary in any way that she told anyone about. She marked it privately in the way she marked most things that mattered to her, by sitting with it for a specific period of time and understanding what she understood about it, then filing it and continuing. What she understood, she had walked into that conference room as one version of herself and had walked out as the same version, but the same version had subsequently been in proximity to something that changed it. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but in the way that significant things changed you, which was gradually, and then all at once, and then simply as the new fact of what you were. She was still the person who heard what other people missed. She was still precise and methodical and better with evidence than with uncertainty. Still someone who needed time to process before she spoke, and quiet to think before she decided. None of that had changed. What had changed the quiet in which she processed was no longer solitary. The time she needed to decide was now often spent in the same room as someone who understood that she needed it and did not try to fill it. The evidence she worked with daily had expanded to include a category she had not had before: the evidence of a child who said home, and meant it the evidence of a man who cooked because his hands needed something to do and who had learned without being taught to wait for her timelines. That was the change. Not smaller, not larger. Just the specific shape it had taken. She was at her workstation on the anniversary Tuesday when Whitfield came home at 3 light surgery day and stopped in the doorway. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking." "You're thinking about something specific." He came in and sat in the chair. "What?" "A year ago today," she said. "The conference room. I was wondering whether you knew when you walked in, whether you had any—" She paused, finding the right word. "Awareness. That it was going to be significant." He was quiet for a moment. "Not in those terms," he said. "I was aware that the case was significant, that the person presenting the findings was someone whose work was going to matter." He looked at her. "The other awareness came later, in the coffee shop on Erie." "What happened in the coffee shop, Na?" "You said certain kinds of attention, and I understood that you meant more than one thing by it. And I understood that you knew I was one of the things you meant." He held her gaze. That was the moment. She had known that was the moment. She had known it then in October in the coffee shop, and had set it aside because the case was ongoing, and the setting aside was the right professional call. She had not stopped knowing it. "We were both very controlled," she said. "We're both very controlled people." He looked at her with the expression that was simply his face, now the one she could read without effort. "It worked out." "It worked out," she agreed. Theo's voice was audible from the living room. He was in the care of Mrs. Kowalski from the first floor until 4, and whatever he was communicating to Mrs. Kowalski had the emphatic quality of someone who wanted to make sure the message was received. "He's explaining something," Whitfield said. "He's always explaining something." She turned back to her screen. "Tell him I'll be done at 4. He knows your schedule." "He monitors my schedule," she said. "There's a difference." "He's thorough," Whitfield said. "He's a lot," she said. "He was always going to be a lot." "Yes," Whitfield said with the specific warmth that had taken her 3 months to read correctly because she had not expected it in that register from someone with his composure. "He was." November. The training curriculum in its 3rd iteration was delivered to all 4 clinic organizations, simultaneously a half-day workshop that Casey helped organize, that Patricia Owens hosted at the Garfield Clinic, that 14 paralegals and junior attorneys attended, with the specific engaged attention of people who are getting something they have needed and have not previously had access to. Nora stood at the front of a room for the first time in a professional capacity that was not a courtroom. She had been a witness before expert, precise adversarial context. This was different. The people in this room were not trying to challenge her. They were trying to learn something, and what they were trying to learn was how to do better work for the people they represented. She taught them what she knew: how to establish chain of custody for audio evidence, what questions to ask when evaluating whether a recording was authentic, the basic spectral characteristics of natural speech versus manufactured speech, when to call a forensic analyst, and what information to have ready when they called, what the report would tell them and what it wouldn't, and how to use both. She had prepared extensively. She delivered it without notes. Patricia Owens found her afterward while people were getting coffee. "They're going to take this and run with it," she said. "That's the point." "I know. I'm telling you because a year ago when Casey called me about you, I had a very specific and limited idea of what we were building. This is not that." "What is it?" Owens looked at the room, the attorneys comparing notes. Two of them already on their phones, presumably looking up cases that now looked different in light of what they'd learned. "Something that works," she said simply. "That's what this is."
But
December and Theo, at 18 months, was a person with clear ideas about how the world should be organized and a developing vocabulary for communicating those ideas that was adding approximately 3 words per day. He said work when Nora went to the workstation in a tone that managed to be both acknowledging and slightly reproachful, the tone of someone who understood that the work was necessary and had opinions about its duration. He said James, not Dad. Not yet the relationship between himself and the man who lived in his house and took the 3 to 6 shift, apparently still being processed in its formal taxonomy, but with the specific expectation that the word would produce the presence. It always did. He said, listen, when there was a sound he wanted someone else to notice, standing very still, with his head tilted in the way that Nora recognized as her own head tilt, the physical position of directed attention. He would stand like that for 30 seconds, and then look at whoever he was with to see if they had heard what he had heard. He's cataloging things, Whitfield said one evening, watching Theo stand very still in the middle of the kitchen in response to something Nora hadn't identified. He always is, she said, but the sound thing is new. He watched Theo's face. He stops what he's doing when there's something in the audio environment he wants to classify. She set down her fork. She had not fully articulated to herself that she had been watching this for 2 weeks. Yes, she said. He might have your ear. He's too young to know. Yes. He watched Theo reach a conclusion about whatever he'd been listening to and resume eating. But it's possible. She looked at her son, the tilted head, the focused attention, the specific quality of listening that she had thought was uniquely hers. If he does, she said, he'll find his own use for it. Yes, Whitfield said. That's exactly right. The year ended on a Saturday when the lake was frozen at the shoreline, and the city had the specific stillness of a place under significant cold that had decided to be beautiful about it. They were in the south-facing living room of the Levitt Greystone, the afternoon light doing its December thing, which was arriving low and golden and making everything look more considered than it was. Theo was asleep in the nursery. Dana was coming in 2 days for the holidays. The apartment was quiet in the particular way of a space that was empty of its main noise source and was resting. Whitfield was reading. Nora was at the end of the sofa with a case file, not working on it actively, but adjacent to it in the way she sometimes was, with cases she was thinking around rather than directly into. She set the file down. I've been thinking about what you said in September, she said, on the porch. He looked up. About the formal question? The marriage question. Yes. She turned toward him. I think I want to. He put his book down. Not because of the form, she said. I meant what I said on the porch. The form doesn't particularly matter to me. But I've been thinking about what the form communicates to Theo as he gets older, about what it means to have something that's named rather than something that's understood. She held his gaze. I want it to be named. What does named look like? He asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. Small, she said. The two of us and the people who were actually part of the story. Casey, Dana, Dr. Rhodes if she'll come. Oh, Owens probably. Marcus Webb. She thought about it. Somewhere that's ours, not a venue. Here, he said. Here, she agreed. In the spring when the windows are open. He looked at her with the expression that was his actual face, the one beneath all the others, the one she had learned to read in October and had been reading ever since with increasing fluency. "All right," he said.
All right,
"Yes." He said it simply the way he said things he meant fully. "In the spring, here, small, whatever is ours rather than performed." She looked at him, at the man who had walked into a conference room in October with a legal team and a career in ruins, and had asked in that context the 3 right questions in 2 hours, and who had not since then stopped asking the right questions, who had learned to wait for her and to be direct with her and to understand the difference between those two things and when each was called for, who had taken the 3 to 6 shift without being asked and built the bookcase shelves and cooked because his hands needed something to do, and had said "I love you" simply on a Tuesday in April without architecture. "I've been certain since January," she said. "I was verifying." "You verified for quite a long time." "I'm thorough." "I know." He reached across the sofa and put his hand on hers. "So am I." Outside, the lake effect afternoon was doing its December thing with unironic commitment. The Greystone held the cold outside and the warmth inside the way. Buildings that have been through enough winters know to do. In the nursery, Theo slept, and in the living room, 2 people sat together in the quiet of a Saturday with the forward edge of what they were building already in view, not complete, not finished, not resolved in the way that conclusions resolved, but present and specific and real in the way that the daily accumulation of chosen things became real. That Nora thought was the evidence, reproducible, documentable, sufficient for action. She had always known what to do with evidence. The spring wedding was on a Saturday in April the 16th, which Nora had selected because it fell in the window between the last reasonable probability of late snow and the beginning of the construction season that made Lincoln Square loud on weekend mornings. 11 people in the Levitt Greystone apartment. The windows were open because April had delivered on its implicit promise, and the late afternoon light came through the south-facing windows in the way it did when it was trying. The furniture had been rearranged and then mostly moved back because the apartment worked best as it was, and the wedding should work in the apartment, rather than the apartment working around the wedding. Casey stood with Nora. Dana stood with Nora. Dr. Rhodes attended. Marcus Webb attended and made the observation afterward to Nora that Whitfield had been a different person since October of the previous year, more present, less managed, and that it was clearly the right change. Patricia Owens attended because she had been part of the story, and because Nora had decided she wanted the people who had been part of the story in the room. They used a civil officiant, a colleague of Casey's, brisk and precise, who understood that they wanted the ceremony to be real rather than theatrical, and delivered it accordingly. Nora wrote her vows in advance. She tested them for accuracy the way she tested reports, reading them back against what she meant, revising where the language didn't match the content. The final version was 43 words. She said them without looking at the paper. Whitfield's vows were not written in advance. She had not expected them to be. He was. She had learned someone who processed important things by thinking rather than drafting, and who arrived at the moment with what he meant rather than a prepared text. He said 7 sentences. The 7th one she would remember, the way you remembered certain recordings, the texture of the voice, the specific inflection, the exact frequency of something real. He said, "You heard what was actually there. I've been trying to be what was actually there ever since." Theo present in the arms of Dana for the duration of the ceremony, and then released into the apartment at large for the gathering that followed. Investigated the changed arrangement of furniture with his characteristic methodical attention, and then reaching a conclusion, navigated to where both of his parents were standing and lifted both arms with the decisive expectation of someone who knew what he wanted. Whitfield picked him up. Theo looked at both of them from this elevated position, taking inventory as he always did, and made the specific sound of satisfaction that meant his assessment was complete and favorable. "He approves," Whitfield said. "He has from the beginning," Nora said. "He just needed to be sure we were keeping up."
Pashitas.
The rest of the spring and the summer that followed had the quality of a life that knew what it was. Not perfect, not resolved in the falsely complete way of things that are finished, but settled in the real way of things that have found their form. Whitfield's career at Northwestern had recovered its full scope, and then some. The 4 years of department leadership that had preceded the administrative leave had established a reputation that the 11 months of destruction had, in the end, not reached the root of. His surgical schedule in the year following the hearing was the busiest of his career. He managed it the way he managed everything that mattered, by being precise about what deserved his attention and eliminating what didn't. Nora's practice grew in the direction she had built it, to grow the commercial caseload funding. The clinic work. The clinic work becoming the thing she was increasingly known for in the specific professional communities where it mattered. The training curriculum was in its fourth iteration by May, having been refined by feedback from 47 paralegals and attorneys across 6 organizations. The framework she had drafted on a kitchen table in November had become the document on which the Forensic Audio Access Project was based, and the project was being cited by a legal aid consortium in the annual report that Casey forwarded to her with a brief message, "You built a thing." She had built a thing. She had been building it since May of the previous year, and before that since October, when she had walked into a conference room and heard, in the particular silence of a man who knew what he'd been falsely accused of and could not yet prove it, what needed to be heard. The project was the form that hearing had taken. Not the only form and not the final form, but the current one, sufficient real growing toward what it needed to become. Theo at 2 was a person with opinions about everything and the language to express most of them. He said, "Listen," and tilted his head and expected the people around him to listen, and they did, because by now it was established that when Theo said listen, there was usually something there. He said home when they came through the door of the Levitt Greystone, which he had been saying since before he could clearly articulate it, since the car in Ohio, when it had been the word for the 2 people in the front seat rather than any particular location. He said work in the acknowledgement and mild reproach tone he had developed for use when the workstation had Nora's attention for longer than seemed to him warranted. He said James with the exact expectation of the word producing the presence, and it always did. And sometimes in the kitchen, when the light was right and there was music on, Whitfield had developed a habit of putting music on in the evenings, something he had not done before Theo, and now did consistently, as if the apartment needed it. Theo stood very still with his head tilted and listened with the full body attention of someone in whom the listening was already at 2 years old, becoming a primary sense. Nora watched this and knew what she was looking at, and did not name it yet, because the right name for something arrived when you had enough evidence and she was still gathering it. She was patient. She had always been patient about the things that mattered. One evening in September, Theo in bed, the apartment quiet, the lake sending whatever it sent through the open windows at that time of year, she sat at her workstation with a new recording and put on her headphones and pressed play. The recording was 41 seconds long. A conversation in a medical office, allegedly authentic, allegedly documenting something it needed not to document. She had been here before. She would always be here in some form at the beginning of a case, with a recording and a question, and the trained attention that had accumulated over 9 years of finding what others had missed. She listened. In the background of the recording, behind the voices, beneath the ambient sound of the office, there was a frequency artifact. She took off her headphones. She opened her software and began to document it, because documentation was what turned the hard into the provable, the known into the actionable, the truth into something that could be used by the people who needed it. That was the work. It had always been the work. She documented it until midnight. Then she saved the file, closed the software, and went to find Whitfield, who was in the kitchen reading in the specific way he occupied a room that had been familiar since November of the previous year and had not in the many months since stopped being exactly right. She sat at the table. "Long one," he said. "Good one." She poured a glass of water. "I found something." "You always find something." "I always find something," she agreed. He looked at her across the table, the kitchen at midnight, the apartment quiet around them. Theo asleep in the nursery, the case file closed for the night, but not for long. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened the way he had always listened, with the full attention, nothing else. The kind of listening she had learned to trust, because it was the kind that was actually present, that was not waiting for its turn to speak, but was genuinely receiving what was being said. The kind she had heard from the beginning, even before she knew what she was hearing. She talked until 1. He listened until 1. And then the apartment on Levitt was quiet, and the lake was whatever it was in September, and Theo slept the absolute sleep of a child who knew his world was safe, and 2 people who had found each other through 43 seconds of a fabricated recording and 1 trained ear, and the extraordinary indirection of consequence sat together in their kitchen and let the night be what it was, which was finally and completely enough. 2 years from the conference room on Michigan Avenue. Nora did not measure time and anniversaries as a rule. She measured it in caseloads and milestones and the steady accumulation of things completed and things begun. But October had become a specific marker, not a wound, not a sentimental observance, just a recognition that October was the month the architecture of her life had changed, and that architecture was worth periodically assessing. The assessment in year 2. The Forensic Audio Access Project was operating as designed a consulting framework, not a nonprofit self-sustaining through the commercial caseload that funded the clinic rates, handling 42 cases in the project's first full fiscal year. The training curriculum having been downloaded and adapted by organizations she had never been in contact with, a fact Casey had discovered and reported with the specific pleasure of a person who appreciated metrics. Theo was 2 years and 3 months old, said approximately 40 new words per week, and had recently developed a practice of bringing objects to Nora at the workstation door to show her things he considered worth noting. He brought a rock, a rubber band, a piece of patterned fabric that had separated from something she couldn't identify, and once memorably a caterpillar from the back steps of the Greystone. He held each object up for her inspection with the specific expectation of being taken seriously, and she took them seriously because they were serious to him, and that was sufficient reason. Whitfield's second year back at full surgical privileges had produced the kind of outcomes that prompted a letter from the hospital board to his department. Not a formal commendation, those being unusual in surgical medicine, but the acknowledgement of a record that spoke clearly for itself. He received the letter with the same equanimity with which he had received everything institutional since January of the previous year, as data appropriate to its category, neither more nor less than what it was. "You could be pleased about it," Nora said. "I'm satisfied," he said. "That's more stable than pleased. I'm going to put that on your tombstone." "It would be accurate," he said without hesitation, and she made the sound that had become her version of a laugh in contexts where she wasn't guarding it. They had been married for 6 months. The marriage had changed and not changed things in the specific ratio she had expected based on what she knew about herself. It had changed the formal context and had not changed the daily texture, because the daily texture had been what it was for 18 months before April, and no form was going to alter something that had been built correctly from the materials. What it had changed, Theo had in the weeks following the small ceremony begun saying James less frequently, and something else more frequently, not a clean version of the word, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first consonant and the vowel that followed. Whitfield had heard it the first time, and had gone very still in the way he went still when something significant arrived without warning. He had not made a production of it. He had simply said in the same register he always used with Theo, "Yeah, that's me." And Theo had said it again as if clarifying, and then moved on to the next thing. The third Dermot development arrived in November, 2 years after the consent agreement. The civil action that Harold Hartley's family had been pursuing, which had been working its way through the court system, with the deliberate pace of civil litigation, reached a settlement. Nora learned about it from Casey, who had learned about it from the Hartley family's attorney, who had included a note. Ms. Callahan's forensic report was entered as evidence and was cited by both sides as the most significant technical document in the case. The family wanted me to convey their acknowledgement. She sat with this for a long time. The work she had done in November of 2 years ago, the 43 seconds she had listened to on the first morning, the 20 minutes to find the artifact, the months of documentation that followed had moved through a chain of consequence she had been able to trace but not predict. Whitfield's career, the consent agreement, the civil action, Harold Hartley's family receiving something from the legal system that they had been seeking for 3 years. That was how it worked when it worked. You found the thing, you named it, it moved through channels you didn't control and couldn't predict, and eventually reached the place where it was needed. Not always, not guaranteed, but sometimes with enough precision and enough rigor, the finding and the consequence were connected and you could see the line. She called Lynn Hartley. Lynn answered on the third ring in the specific tone of someone who had been waiting for this call without knowing they were waiting. "Ms. Callahan? Mrs. Hartley, I heard about the settlement. I wanted to call rather than send a message. We were hoping you would." A pause. "Harold knows. He wanted me to tell you he's been thinking about what you said in the letter, that your job was to give language to what he already knew." Nora had written a letter to Harold Hartley 18 months ago. A short 1-3 paragraphs explaining what she had found and what it meant in plain language outside the legal process directly to him. She had not been required to write it. She had decided to. "How is he?" she asked. "Better," Lynn said with the specific weight of someone for whom better was a word that contained its full history. "The settlement helps. Not because of the money, though, that matters, because the record is clear now. What happened is documented correctly." Another pause. "He can say what happened now and have it match the official version. That matters to him more than I expected it to." "It would," Nora said, "having your knowledge match the record. That's not a small thing." "No," Lynn said. "It isn't." She told Whitfield about the call that evening. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without commentary, while she was still talking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The letter you wrote him," he said. "You didn't tell me at the time. I wasn't sure it was the right thing to do. I did it anyway." "Why?" She thought about it. Because he knew. He'd been sitting with something he knew was true and couldn't make the official version say the same thing. "I've spent my career fixing that gap between what people know and what can be proven." He deserved to know that the gap had been fixed, even outside the official channel. The official channel had already done its work. That letter was for him, not for the record. Whitfield looked at her. "That's not the work as it's usually defined." "No," she agreed, "but it's the work." He nodded slowly with the consideration he gave to things that mattered. "I wrote a letter too," he said, "after the consent agreement, to Dermot." She had not known this. "What did it say?" "That I didn't forgive him, that wasn't the right word for it. That I understood he'd been afraid and had made a catastrophic choice, and that understanding didn't change the consequence, but I wanted him to know I wasn't carrying it as hatred, that it was over." He paused. "I don't know if it helped him. I know it helped me." "You didn't tell me." "I wasn't sure it was the right thing to do," he said. "I did it anyway." She looked at him across the kitchen table. This was what 2 years looked like. She thought, not the absence of things undisclosed, but the gradual filling in of them, the accumulating picture of who a person was in all their dimensions, including the ones they did alone and told you later. "Good," she said. "Which part?" "Both parts," she said. "That you did it and that you told me."
Boss.
Theo at 2.5 was attempting to read. Not successfully, he was 2.5, but with the systematic commitment of someone who had identified a skill that other people had and had decided that the gap between himself and that skill was a problem to be solved rather than a limit to be accepted. He brought books to Nora and pointed at words and looked at her with the focused expectation she had come to recognize as his primary mode of acquiring knowledge. He found the person in the room most likely to have the information he needed and directed his attention at them until the information was transferred. She taught him letters. Whitfield taught him sounds, not phonics exactly. Just the sounds that different objects made and how sound changed with distance and material and context. Theo absorbed this with the same alert attention he brought to the letter lessons, categorizing sounds the way he categorized everything building the system. "He's going to understand the work," Whitfield said one evening, watching Theo conduct an experiment with spoons and glasses and the varying pitches they produced. "He's 2.5, Nora said. "He's building a model of how sound works. He's playing." "They're the same thing at this stage," Whitfield said. "The model and the play." She watched her son tap a glass carefully with a spoon tilt. His head tap it again at a different angle. He looked at her. "Different," he said. "Different," she agreed, "because of the angle." He accepted this. He tapped the glass at a third angle. He looked at her again. "Smaller," she said. He nodded as if he had confirmed something he already suspected and moved on to the next glass. "He has your ear," Whitfield said. "We don't know that yet," she said. "We know," he said. "We're just being careful about knowing." She thought about that. The difference between knowing and claiming to know, between the data and the conclusion, between the instinct and the documented finding. She had spent her career navigating that difference. She was navigating it now, watching her son work out the relationship between angle and pitch with a set of kitchen glasses on a Tuesday evening. "Yes," she said, "we're being careful." The December before Theo turned 3, Nora received a call from a law school. The clinical director of the Northwestern Law Evidence Clinic had been following the Forensic Audio Access Project. Following the training curriculum, the case outcomes, the framework, and wanted to discuss a partnership. A course, possibly. Or a clinic component. Something that would bring forensic audio authentication into the formal legal education curriculum, which had the director set a significant gap in this area. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 weeks with the methodical attention she gave to significant decisions. She mapped the time requirements, the existing caseload, the project infrastructure. She talked to Casey, who said she'd been waiting for this call since year one. She talked to Owens, who said it would change what clinics like hers could recruit for law graduates with training in this area, rather than trying to build it post hoc. She talked to Whitfield, which she had always done when the decision mattered, and which she did now less because she needed his input, and more because thinking with him produced clearer thinking than thinking alone. "What's the hesitation?" he asked. "Scale," she said. "The project works because I built it to be sustainable at this scale. A law school partnership adds load. Can the framework absorb the load? Not without modification." What kind of modification? She had already been thinking about this. A second analyst, not an employee, a consulting relationship with someone I trust to maintain the methodology. She paused. "I have someone in mind." "Then the hesitation isn't real." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You already know what you're going to do. You're verifying it before you say yes." He held her gaze. "That's what you always do with the things that matter." She thought about October 2 years ago, the lease she had stared at for 4 days. The apartment on Levitt, the paint roller, the lake in Ohio, the April ceremony with 11 people and 43 words. "Yes," she said. "That's what I do." "How much longer do you need to verify?" 3 more days, she said. "Then I'll put it in the calendar," he said. "Saturday. You tell the law school yes." She told the law school yes on Saturday. The course was scheduled for the following academic year. She contacted the second analyst, a former colleague named Sandra Raines, whose methodology she trusted completely, and Sandra said yes within 48 hours, with the brevity of someone for whom yes to the right thing required no extended consideration. Nora noted this as a favorable data point regarding Sandra's judgment. February and Theo's 3rd birthday, which arrived with the conviction of a child who had been anticipating it and was prepared to engage fully. The gathering was larger than the first year. Not large, but larger because the circle of people who had become part of the story had expanded in the way that circles do when the story moves forward. Harold and Lynn Hartley came, which had been Nora's suggestion, and which Harold had accepted with the specific dignity of a man who understood the invitation. Sandra Raines came, the paralegal from the Garfield Clinic, who had taken the training curriculum and run with it in the way Owens had predicted, a woman named Keisha Alvarez, who had become over 2 years the kind of person Nora thought of as part of the work, rather than just adjacent to it. Theo navigated the gathering with his characteristic systematic focus, and at some point in the afternoon he found his way to Harold Hartley, who was sitting near the window with the stillness of a man for whom stillness was partly natural and partly the legacy of what had happened to him, and stood in front of him with the assessment face. Harold looked at him. Theo looked at Harold. Theo held up the rock he'd been carrying in his pocket, a particular piece of gravel from the back steps that he had been monitoring for 3 weeks and had apparently decided was worth sharing. Harold took it. He looked at it. He said something that took longer than it used to take because language was still something he had to work for, but he said it clearly, "Good rock." Theo nodded. He took the rock back and put it in his pocket and moved on. Nora had watched this from across the room. Whitfield appeared beside her. "He knew who that was," Whitfield said. "He met Harold at this door," she said. "He was assessing." "And the rock." She watched her son navigate toward the food table with the focused intention of someone who had concluded one investigation and was ready for the next. "He was giving him something," she said. "The rock matters to Theo. He gave Harold something that matters." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "That's his mother," he said. "Or his father," she said. He looked at her. "The letter," she said. "To Dermot. Giving someone something when you didn't have to. That's the same impulse." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd said something that landed wrong. Then, "I hadn't connected those." "I had," she said, "about a month after you told me." He looked at Theo, who had reached the food table and was making decisions with the seriousness the situation warranted. "He's going to be a lot," Whitfield said. "He always was," she said. "Yes." He put his arm around her briefly, the familiar warmth of it. "So are you." "I know," she said. "It's a feature," he said. She leaned into him for a moment, just a moment, the way she allowed herself these things now in the daily life register that had taken her longer to inhabit than anything else, and that she had been inhabiting increasingly without effort. Then she straightened up and watched the party around them. Lynn Hartley was talking to Casey. Sandra Raines was talking to Keisha Alvarez about something that looked from the hand gestures like a case. Dana was taking photographs of Theo making decisions at the food table. Dr. Rhodes was talking to Marcus Webb. Harold Hartley was sitting near the window, the piece of gravel still in his hand, looking out at the February afternoon with the expression of someone who was simply here and had decided that being here was enough. Outside Lincoln Square was doing its February thing. Inside, the Levitt Greystone was warm and full of people who had been part of what had happened and were now in the room together, which was the right room to be in. Theo came back with food and held some of it up for Nora's inspection. "Good?" she asked. "Good," he confirmed and sat down to eat it with the complete commitment of someone who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. She watched him. She thought about the conference room in October 3 years ago and the 43 seconds and the frequency artifact in the background noise that her ear had been trained to find and that had set everything in motion. Whitfield's career, the consent agreement, the Hartley settlement, the project, the law school course, the people in this room. She thought about what Lynn Hartley had said. You gave it a language that people could hear. That was the work. She had always known that was the work. What she had not known 3 years ago was that the language you gave things eventually became the language you lived in, that the precision you brought to documentation and testimony and training became gradually the precision you brought to everything else, including the things you were building rather than analyzing the things you were inside rather than reporting on. She was inside this now, completely specifically with the full attention she had always given to things that mattered. That was, she thought, exactly right. That evening, after the gathering had ended and Dana had driven back to Columbus and Theo had gone to sleep with the absolute conviction of a child who had done everything required of him and was done for the day, Nora sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the specific quiet of an apartment that had settled into itself. Whitfield sat across from her. He was not reading, not reviewing case notes, just present in the way he had learned to be present in their kitchen without agenda, without filling the quiet unnecessarily. They had been sitting like this for a long time, off and on, in kitchens and living rooms, and on porches and in cars on long drives. She had not always been able to sit this way, had in the early months felt the need to have something in front of her work, or a book, or a case file, something to justify the occupation of the space. She did not feel that need anymore. Harold kept the rock, she said. I know. He had been there when Harold had pocketed it carefully, as he left the specific care of someone storing something worth storing. Theo will notice. He'll ask for an update, she said. In 2 or 3 weeks. He tracks things. Yes. He looked at her. Like someone I know. He'll find his own use for it, she said. The tracking. He will. Whitfield turned his coffee cup, the habitual gesture, the hands needing something to do. The law school course. Does it feel like what you wanted to build? It feels like the next thing, she said. I've stopped trying to know what I wanted to build before I'm building it. I build what's next, and then I see what it becomes. That's different from how you operated 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I had a specific plan, she said. The plan was useful. It got me to the next decision. But the thing I built is different from the plan. She looked at him. That's true of most of the things I've built in the last 3 years, including this. Including this, she agreed. I didn't plan any of it. The conference room, the case, the pregnancy, the apartment, you. She held his gaze. None of it was in any plan I had. And yet, she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The surgeon's hands, the ones that had been in the photographs she had researched before she met him and had since become one of the most familiar things in her daily life. She turned her hand and held his. Outside February was doing what February in Chicago did, which was commit to itself completely and without apology. Inside, the Greystone held the cold outside and the warmth inside, as it had since they moved in, as it had for the century before they moved in. In the nursery, Theo slept. Harold Hartley's rock was in his pocket on the floor beside the bed, because Theo kept things he considered significant close. The case file on Nora's desk in the second bedroom was a new one. 47 seconds of conversation in an office, allegedly authentic, with something in the background noise that she had not yet found, but could feel at the threshold of her trained attention, the way she always felt it before her software confirmed what she already knew. She would find it in the morning. She always did, but not tonight. Tonight the kitchen was warm and the tea was good, and the man across the table was the man across the table, and Theo was asleep. and the project was building toward its next shape, and the life was exactly what it was specific and chosen and full of the forward edge of things still being built. She looked at Whitfield. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything because the room had everything it needed. That was finally and completely enough. That was as it had been since October 3 years ago, since 43 seconds and a frequency artifact and one trained ear in a darkened studio, the whole thing. The finding, the naming, the making available of what had been hidden, and then in the daily specific life that followed the evidence of it, accumulating reproducible sufficient for everything she needed it to be.
Oh, sir.
March, and the law school partnership taking its first formal shape. The clinical director, a woman named Professor Alicia Crane, who had the organized intensity of someone running 16 things simultaneously and making each one believe it had her full attention, had asked for a preliminary meeting to discuss course design. Nora arrived at the Northwestern Law Building with an outline she had spent 3 weeks refining and found that Crane had arrived with one as well, which was the best possible opening to a working relationship. They spent 2 hours in productive disagreement about course structure, which was to say they disagreed about 3 specific elements resolved 2, through the examination of what each served pedagogically, and flagged the third for a second meeting because they needed more information about the existing curriculum to make the decision correctly. "You're not what I expected," Crane said at the end. "What did you expect? Someone more protective of the methodology?" She looked at Nora. "Usually when I bring in external expertise, there's a period of territory negotiation. You want the students to actually be able to use this." "The students are the point," Nora said. "The methodology serves them, not the other way around." Crane nodded with the expression of someone filing this for future reference. "The clinic students specifically, they'll be working with evidence that comes from clients who have already been through significant difficulty. How do you approach that in the teaching?" "You teach them what the recording tells them," Nora said. "Not what they hope it tells them, not what their client needs it to tell them what it actually tells them. And then you teach them to use that, whatever it is, in the most effective way available. Even when it's not what the client needs. Especially then, the recording that doesn't say what you hoped is still information. It tells you something about where the case has to go next." She paused. "I've had cases where my analysis found nothing wrong with a recording that my client was hoping I'd discredit. Those are harder. But the work is the same." Crane looked at her. "You should know I was referred to you by Lynn Hartley's attorney." Nora held that. "He said your report in that case was the most precisely useful forensic document he'd worked with in 20 years of practice, and that the letter you wrote to Harold Hartley directly was the most unexpected thing he'd seen in a forensic engagement, and also probably the most important." She had not known the letter had registered outside of Harold and Lynn. She had written it because it was the right thing to do and had not tracked its downstream effects. "He quoted something from it," Crane said. "I have it here, actually." She found it in her notes. She read. The recording said what someone needed it to say rather than what was true. "My job was to show the gap between those two things. That gap is now part of the official record. What you knew before I started is now verifiable by anyone who looks." Nora looked at the quote. She remembered writing it late at night after the hearing, trying to find the version of the explanation that was accurate and also useful to the person receiving it. "That's what the course should teach," Crane said. "That, whatever that is." "It's what the work is," Nora said. "It's not a technique. It's a way of understanding what you're doing and why." "Can it be taught?" "Some of it. The way of seeing it, yes. The specific ear," she paused. "Some people have it. Most people can develop a functional version. The ones who are going to be excellent at it, they already know something is wrong before they know why. You teach them the why." Crane considered this. "Your son," she said. "I read the profile Casey Park sent. She mentioned he shows some of the same listening qualities." "He's 3, Nora said. "I know, but she mentioned it." Crane looked at her. "Does that change anything about why the work matters about what you're building?" She thought about Theo with the kitchen glasses and the spoons building his model of how angle and material changed sound. She thought about him standing very still with his head tilted when there was something in the audio environment worth classifying. She thought about the rock he had given Harold Hartley, which was not about sound, but was about the same thing, which was about noticing what mattered and responding to it. "He'll find his own form for it," she said, "whatever he has. The work I'm building, it won't be for him directly. It'll be the field he inherits, The gap between known and provable, if I make that gap smaller for the people working in it now, then whoever works in it 20 years from now has a better starting point, including him if that's what he chooses. That's a long game, Crane said. Yes, Nora said. It is. Spring came, and with it, the first session of evidence and audio authentication in the legal clinic. 12 law students, a Thursday afternoon seminar room in the Northwestern Law Building that smelled of old carpet and radiator heat, and the specific ambition of people who had come this far and were still going. Nora stood at the front of the room and taught them what she knew. She had stood in courtrooms. She had sat in conference rooms. She had worked alone in darkened studios with headphones on and the specific focused attention of someone tracking a signal through noise. She had testified and reported and documented and trained. Each of those had required a different form of the same fundamental work, making the hidden audible to someone who needed to hear it. Teaching, she discovered, was another form. Not the same different demands, different feedback loops, the satisfaction arriving in different intervals and through different channels, but the same fundamental work, making something available that had not been available before. The 12 students looked at her with the attention of people who had been told this mattered and were prepared to believe it if she could show them why. She showed them. She played them recordings, real cases, anonymized the kind of recordings that came from real situations where real things were at stake. She showed them what authentic speech looked like on a spectrogram. She showed them what manufactured speech looked like. She showed them the artifact, the specific frequency signature that appeared when audio was processed in the wrong way. The thing her ear had been trained to find before her software confirmed it. One of the 12 students, a second year named Marcus Osei, who had the specific quality of focus that she recognized as the instinct, the thing that was either there or wasn't said, when she played the first manipulated recording, something's off in the ambient noise. She looked at him. Where? He pointed to a section of the waveform on screen, not the right section exactly, but adjacent to it, the right general region. Close, she said. Here. She marked the actual point. Tell me what's different between this section and this one. He looked at the screen for a long time. The background sounds more processed. Yes, she said, that's exactly it. The rest of the class was listening now with a different quality of attention. They had seen one of them hear something, and this changed what they believed was possible. She taught them for the next 90 minutes. Afterward, Marcus Osei stayed. He asked 3 questions, the right 3, the ones that probed the methodology's edge cases rather than its center. She answered them precisely. He thanked her and left. She walked to her car through the spring afternoon with the specific feeling she associated with work that had gone the right way. Not triumph, not pride, but the settled satisfaction of something completed with the rigor it required. Casey called while she was driving. How was the first session? One of them heard it, she said. Heard what? The artifact. Before I pointed to it. She navigated a red light on Michigan Avenue. He's going to be excellent. Because of you. Because it was already in him, she said. I just pointed at where to look. That's teaching, Casey said. Yes, she said. I'm starting to understand that. June and Theo at 3.5 had moved from attempting to read to actually reading simple words carefully with the same systematic attention that characterized everything he did. He sounded out letters with concentration and then assembled them and then looked at whoever was present to confirm that he had found the right thing. Dog, he said one morning, pointing at a word in a board book. Dog, Nora confirmed. He moved to the next word. He read it. He looked at her. Yes, she said. He moved on. He was not performing, he was verifying. The look he gave her after each word was the specific look of someone checking their finding against an independent source, which was not. She recognized a reading behavior she had taught him. It was a thinking behavior he already had. Whitfield watched this from the kitchen doorway. He's doing the same thing you do, he said. I know. With waveforms. When you find something, you check it against the baseline before you document it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Do you find that alarming or reassuring? She thought about it honestly. Reassuring, she said. He's going to be rigorous about things that matter to him, whatever those things turn out to be. She looked at Theo, who had moved on to the next page with the focused determination of someone who has committed to seeing a thing through. I can work with rigorous. He'll find his own thing, Whitfield said. Yes, she agreed, but the rigor is already his. That part was going to be true regardless. Whitfield came in and sat at the table. Theo, sensing a shift in the room's configuration, looked up, assessed, and returned to his book. He had reached a word that was giving him difficulty. She could tell from the furrowed brow, the mouth working through the phonemes. "Slow down," she said. "Sound it out." He slowed down. He sounded it out. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. He moved on. She watched him and thought about the course she was teaching and the students who were learning to hear what was actually there, and the framework she had built that was now being used by people she had never met in cities she hadn't been to. She thought about Harold Hartley's rock in Theo's pocket and the letter she had written and the 43 seconds that had set everything in motion. She thought about Whitfield in a conference room in October asking the 3 right questions, and about herself in a car in the parking lot of a prenatal clinic crying for 3 minutes in the specific way you cried when you understood that something enormous had happened. She thought the evidence accumulates. You gather it and you document it and you make it available and you trust the chain of consequence to move it where it needs to go. You can't control where it goes. You can only do the finding and the naming correctly and then let it move. That was the work. That had always been the work. She was still doing it. She would still be doing it in some form for as long as there were recordings in which something had been hidden that someone needed to hear. Theo finished the page. He closed the book, assessed it for a moment, and opened it again from the beginning. "Again?" she asked. "Again," he said, with the certainty of someone who understood that a second pass was part of the methodology. She held the book open for him and watched him begin. Outside the graystone windows, Lincoln Square was going about its June morning with the unhurried energy of a neighborhood that knew what it was and didn't need to prove anything. The lake was somewhere to the east doing whatever it was doing. The apartment was warm and quiet and organized around the things that mattered in it. Whitfield moved in the kitchen. Theo read. Nora held the book and listened to her son work through the words with the patience and rigor and the willingness to go back to the beginning. That were, she thought, the most important things you could have. She had built a life, as it turned out, on exactly those qualities. She was glad she had.